What if Deku was Yoriichi's reincarnation and had sun breathing as his quirk? Okay, hear me out, Yoriichi is basically the strongest character in Demon Slayer history. This guy almost soloed Musen, created every breathing technique that exists, and could literally see through people with transparent world. Now imagine those abilities in someone with Deku's heart for saving people. In this story, demons are secretly being created as bioquirk threats, and Izuku has to awaken these ancient memories while juggling one for all. We get demon-human hybrids, League of Villains experiments, and Deku learning to melt steel with his breath while somehow still being the most wholesome hero ever. Hit that like if you're ready for this, and let's jump in. The convenience store's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Izuku Midoriya counted his change for the third time. 47 yen left from his allowance. Enough for a single pack of instant ramen, but not the good kind with the little vegetable packets. Just the noodles then, he muttered, sliding the coins across the counter. The cashier barely looked up from his phone. Outside, the autumn sky was already darkening, even though it wasn't even 7 yet. October always felt like this, rushed, like the world couldn't wait to get to winter. Izuku tucked the ramen into his backpack alongside his worn hero analysis notebook and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The familiar weight of disappointment settled in his chest. Another day of watching heroes on the news, another day of scribbling notes about quirks he'd never have. His phone buzzed. A text from his mom, working late again. Heat up some leftovers. Mom, he typed back a quick okay and started the walk home to their apartment complex. 3 blocks through the quieter part of Musu Tafu, where the buildings were older and the streetlights flickered more than they should. That's when he heard the screaming. Izuku's head snapped up. 2 streets over, maybe 3. Close enough that the sound carried clearly through the evening air, not the usual urban noise, but something desperate, panicked. His feet were moving before his brain caught up. Heroes will handle it, he told himself, even as he jogged toward the commotion. Pro heroes are always faster than, he rounded the corner and stopped dead. The thing crouched in the middle of the intersection wasn't human. It had been maybe, once. The basic shape was there, 2 arms, 2 legs ahead, but everything else was wrong. Muscles bulged in unnatural places, making its limbs too long and joints bend at impossible angles. Its skin had a grayish pallor that seemed to absorb the streetlight rather than reflect it, and when it turned its head, Izuku caught a glimpse of teeth that were definitely not regulation human issue. 3 civilians huddled behind an overturned car. A middle-aged man clutched his shoulder, dark stains seeping between his fingers. A woman held a crying child against her chest, both of them shaking. "Stay back," the voice came from above. Death Arms, a B-list hero Izuku recognized, stood on a fire escape with his fists already enlarged. "Authorities are en route," the creature, bioquirk threat, Izuku's mind supplied automatically, because that's what the news called these rare incidents, tilted its head at Death Arms like a curious dog. Then it smiled, revealing way too many teeth. It moved faster than anything that size should move. Death Arms barely got his arms up in time to block the leap. The impact sent him crashing through the fire escape's metal grating in a shower of sparks. He hit the pavement hard and didn't get up. Where are the other heroes? Izuku pressed himself against the wall of a closed shop, heart hammering. Someone should be here by now. Someone always comes. The creature dropped to all fours, sniffing the air. Its head swiveled toward the civilians. The little girl's crying got louder. "No, no, no," Izuku whispered, watching the thing's muscles bunch for another leap. Death Arms groaned but couldn't seem to coordinate his limbs. The man with the injured shoulder was trying to shield the woman and child with his body, but what could he do against something that had just taken down a pro hero? The creature pounced. Izuku's vision went white around the edges. His chest seized up, that familiar feeling like someone had replaced his lungs with concrete blocks. Panic attack, now of all times. His hands shook as he fumbled for his inhaler, but the plastic case slipped from his sweaty fingers and clattered across the sidewalk. "Breathe," he told himself desperately. "Just breathe. Count to 10. In through the nose, out through the something shifted. The breathing technique his mom had taught him for the panic attacks felt different. Instead of the shallow, controlled puffs that usually helped, his lungs pulled in a deep, steady stream of air. Not desperate gulps, but something rhythmic, purposeful. Heat bloomed in his chest. Not the burning sensation of anxiety, but something warm and alive. It spread down his arms, pooled in his stomach, crept up his neck until even his fingertips tingled with it. The panic was still there, but pushed to the edges, manageable. "What's happening to me?" The creature's claws were 6 inches from the little girl's face when Izuku found himself standing in the middle of the intersection. He had no memory of moving. One second he'd been pressed against the shop wall, the next he was between the monster and the family, one hand outstretched. His palm felt like he'd been holding it over a campfire. The creature paused, nostrils flaring. "Hey," Izuku said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "Look at me instead." It did. Up close, the thing was even worse. Its eyes were human, brown, like Izuku's, but the pupils were wrong. Too large, and they reflected light like an animal's. Saliva dripped from its jaws, and there was something moving under its skin, like worms writhing just beneath the surface. "I'm going to die," Izuku thought with perfect clarity. "I'm 14 years old, I don't have a quirk, and I'm going to die trying to protect people I don't even know." The strange heat in his chest pulsed in response, and suddenly he could see things. Not different things, the same intersection, the same monster, the same terrified family. But he could see the micro-expressions on the creature's face. The tension in its muscles that telegraphed which way it would dodge, the exact angle of its shoulders that meant it was about to strike. Like someone had turned up the resolution on his vision and slowed down time just enough for him to process everything. The creature lunged. Izuku's body moved without consulting his brain. His breathing shifted into a pattern he'd never learned but somehow knew: long inhale, controlled exhale, each breath building the heat in his chest until it felt like he'd swallowed the sun. His right hand swept up in a perfect arc, and the air around his palm shimmered with heat distortion. His fingers made contact with the creature's forehead. The effect was immediate. Where his skin touched its gray flesh, steam rose in delicate spirals. The creature's forward momentum stopped like it had hit a wall. It staggered backward, shaking its head and making a sound halfway between a whine and a growl. For a moment, they stood there staring at each other. The creature touched its forehead with one clawed hand, then looked at the fingers like it expected to see blood. "What?" Izuku breathed. The creature's lips pulled back in what might have been a snarl or might have been fear. It backed away from him step by step, keeping its eyes fixed on his face. When it reached the edge of the intersection, it turned and bolted into the maze of alleyways that connected this part of the city. Izuku's legs gave out. The pavement was cold and rough against his knees. The heat in his chest was fading, replaced by exhaustion that felt like someone had drained all the water from his body. His right hand was still warm, but the rest of him was shaking. "Kid," Death Arms limped over, his hero costume torn and dirty. "What the hell did you think you were doing?" "I don't know," Izuku said honestly. "I really don't know." The family he'd tried to protect was gone, smart of them to run while the creature was distracted. The injured man had left a trail of blood drops, but they were all alive. That was what mattered. Death Arms helped him to his feet, studying his face with the kind of professional assessment heroes used. "You got a quirk registration, kid." "I don't have a quirk." The words came out automatically, the same response he'd given teachers and classmates and doctors for years. "Right?" Death Arms didn't sound convinced. "And I suppose that thing just decided to run away because it was shy." Before Izuku could answer, 3 black vans turned the corner with their lights off. Not police vans, not ambulances. These were sleek, government-issued vehicles that screamed official business and classified information. Men and women in dark suits poured out before the vans had fully stopped. They moved with the kind of coordinated efficiency that made Izuku think of nature documentaries about pack hunters. Within 30 seconds, they had the entire intersection cordoned off with tape that read HPSC, authorized personnel only. A woman who looked like she was in charge approached them. She was maybe 40, with steel gray hair pulled into a severe bun and the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Death Arms," she said, pulling out a tablet. "Preliminary report. Bioquirk threat, category unknown," Death Arms replied, slipping into formal language. "Single entity, humanoid configuration, engaged at 1947 hours. Suspect fled the scene after civilian interference." Her gaze shifted to Izuku. The smile never wavered, but he felt like a bug under a microscope. "Civilian interference," she repeated. "How interesting. And you are?" "Midoriya Izuku," he managed. "Age 14, quirk." The question hung in the air. Izuku opened his mouth to give his usual answer, but the woman held up one finger. "Think carefully before you respond, Midoriya-kun. False information provided to HPSC agents during a crisis incident carries serious legal penalties." His throat felt dry. I don't know what happened. I've never manifested a quirk before." She made a note on her tablet. "Late-onset manifestation during extreme stress. It happens more often than people think. Particularly with hereditary respiratory specialists." "Hereditary what now?" But she was already walking away, barking orders at the other agents. Two of them started collecting samples from the spot where the creature had been standing. Another was taking photographs of scorch marks on the pavement that Izuku was pretty sure hadn't been there before. Midori Yakun. The woman's voice carried from across the intersection. You should go home now. And if I were you, I'd start keeping a quirk development journal. Something tells me you're going to need it. Death Arms walked him to the edge of the cordoned area, then stopped. Kid, he said quietly, whatever just happened here? Don't go around trying it again without proper training. You got lucky this time. What do you mean lucky? That thing was hunting. They don't usually run from humans. Death Arms looked back at the scene, where agents were loading equipment cases that probably cost more than Izuku's family made in a year. Something about you made it decide you weren't prey. That's not normal. He left Izuku standing on the sidewalk with his backpack full of cheap ramen and a head full of questions that didn't have answers. The walk home took forever. Every shadow looked like it might be hiding something with too many teeth. Every alley mouth could conceal gray skin and reflecting eyes. But nothing jumped out at him, and by the time he reached his apartment building, the adrenaline had mostly faded. What remained was exhaustion and a persistent warm ache in his chest and the taste of copper in his mouth. He touched his nose. His fingers came away red, nosebleed. His mom would panic if she saw it. She'd want to take him to the hospital, make a fuss, ask questions he couldn't answer. Because how do you explain that you might have developed a quirk by accident during what was probably a terrorist attack? Hereditary respiratory specialists. What did that even mean? Izuku climbed the stairs to their apartment, fishing his key out of his backpack. His right hand was still warmer than the left, and when he held it up to the hallway light, he could swear he saw faint wisps of steam rising from his palm. Inside the apartment, he went straight to the bathroom and splashed cold water on his face until the bleeding stopped. In the mirror, he looked the same as always, messy green hair, freckles, eyes that were too wide and too earnest. But there was something different in his expression, a confidence that hadn't been there this morning. I stood up to that thing, he realized. I saved people. Maybe he still couldn't throw a proper punch or run a mile without wheezing. Maybe he still flinched when Kacchan raised his voice, and maybe he still spent too much time dreaming about heroes instead of being one. But for 30 seconds in that intersection, he had been something more than quirkless Deku. His phone buzzed with another message from his mom. Everything okay? Heard there was some kind of incident in the neighborhood. He typed back, all fine, just studying. It wasn't exactly a lie. He was learning something tonight, even if he didn't know what it was yet. Izuku pulled out his hero analysis notebook and flipped to a fresh page. At the top, he wrote, Quirk Development Day 1. Then he stared at the blank page for 10 minutes, trying to figure out how to describe something he didn't understand. Finally, he wrote, breathing felt different, heat in chest/hands. Creature afraid, check family history respiratory specialists. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Outside his window, the first faint glow of dawn was creeping over the city's skyline. Somewhere in those streets, heroes were probably still hunting for the gray-skinned creature. HPSC agents were filing reports about bioquirk threats and late-onset quirk manifestations. And in a small apartment in Musutafu, a 14-year-old boy who had never been anything special fell asleep at his desk, with his hands still warm and his dreams full of fire. Izuku woke up with his face stuck to his notebook. The page was damp with drool, and his neck felt like someone had spent the night using it as a pretzel. Sunlight streamed through his bedroom window, and his alarm clock informed him that he had exactly 12 minutes to get ready for school. Crap, crap, crap! He stumbled to the bathroom, splashing water on his face and trying to make his hair look less like he'd been electrocuted. His reflection looked normal, no mysterious glowing eyes or obvious signs of supernatural transformation. Just regular old Deku, running late as usual. But when he held his hands under the running water, steam rose from his palms. Izuku jerked his hands back like the faucet had bit him. The steam was faint, barely visible, but definitely there. He pressed his palms against the cool ceramic of the sink and watched tiny wisps curl upward. Okay, he whispered to himself. So that really happened. 10 minutes later, he was jogging toward Aldera Junior High with his backpack bouncing against his spine and his mind racing faster than his feet. Every few steps, he'd flex his fingers experimentally, checking to see if the warmth was still there. It was a gentle heat that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. Hereditary respiratory specialists. The HPSC agent's words had been bouncing around his skull all night. What did that even mean? And why had she made it sound like she knew something he didn't? School passed in a blur of half-heard lectures and worried glances at his hands. During lunch, while his classmates argued about some hero ranking list, Izuku found himself in the library's computer section, typing search terms into the outdated browser. Respiratory specialist Quirks returned mostly medical articles about heroes who worked in rescue operations, people who could create air bubbles underwater or filter toxins from their lungs. Useful, but not exactly what had happened last night. Midoriya family history got him nothing but a social media page for some distant cousin in Osaka who posted too many pictures of her cat. Heat-based breathing techniques led him down a rabbit hole of yoga websites and meditation blogs. Most of it was new age nonsense about chakras and inner fire, but buried in the search results was an old academic paper titled Traditional Mountain Rescue Methods in Pre-Quirk Japan. The paper was dry as toast, full of academic language and footnotes, but one section made Izuku sit up straighter. High-altitude rescuers of the Kamado region employed specialized breathing techniques to regulate core body temperature and maintain performance in extreme conditions. Families often passed these methods through generations, with some bloodlines demonstrating remarkable thermal control abilities that preceded documented quirk manifestations by several decades. Kamado. His mom's maiden name had been Kamado. Find something interesting? Izuku nearly jumped out of his skin. Kacchan was standing behind him, reading over his shoulder with that predatory smile that usually meant someone was about to have a very bad day. Just research, Izuku said, closing the browser tab as casually as possible. For a project. Research, Kacchan's eyes narrowed. On breathing techniques. What kind of loser researches breathing? The kind who wants to get better at running. It wasn't entirely a lie. Izuku's stamina had always been terrible. Kacchan stared at him for a long moment like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Then he snorted and walked away, muttering something about useless Deku under his breath. But there had been something else in his expression. Something almost like curiosity. That afternoon, during hero law class, Izuku couldn't concentrate. His right hand kept getting warm, and twice he caught himself breathing in the same deep, rhythmic pattern from the night before. Each time, the warmth spread a little further up his arm, and the world around him seemed to sharpen slightly. He could hear the teacher's heartbeat from across the room. He could smell the faint traces of different deodorants and perfumes from his classmates. The sensory input made his head throb. Control, he told himself, forcing his breathing back to normal. Don't let it get away from you. But whose voice was that in his head? It didn't sound like his own thoughts. It was calmer, more confident, like someone older giving advice. After school, instead of going straight home, Izuku took a detour through Dagoba Municipal Beach Park. The beach was a disaster. Years of illegal dumping had turned it into a junkyard by the sea. But it was also deserted, which made it perfect for what he had in mind. He found a spot between two rusted cars and sat down cross-legged on the sand. The sun was already low in the sky, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. Okay, he thought, let's figure this out. He closed his eyes and focused on his breathing. In through the nose, slow and steady. Out through the mouth, controlled and even. The pattern felt familiar, like muscle memory from a life he'd never lived. Heat blossomed in his chest. This time, instead of panicking, he let it happen. The warmth spread down his arms, pooled in his stomach, crept up his neck. His skin began to tingle, and when he opened his eyes, he could see steam rising from his arms. Good, said the voice that wasn't quite his own. Feel the rhythm. Let it flow through you. Who are you? Izuku whispered. But there was no answer, just the gentle guidance of breathing techniques he'd never learned and battle instincts he'd never developed. When he stood up and moved through what felt like sword forms without a sword, his body knew exactly how to step, exactly how to pivot, exactly how to strike. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. And it gave him a splitting headache. By the time he made it home, his vision was swimming and his temples felt like someone was driving nails into them. His mom was in the kitchen, humming while she cooked dinner, and the smell of miso soup made his stomach rumble. Welcome home, sweetie, she called. How was school? Fine, he managed, dropping his backpack by the door. Hey, Mom, can I ask you something about Dad's side of the family? Of course. What do you want to know? The HPSC mentioned something about respiratory specialists in our family history. His mom went very still. The wooden spoon in her hand stopped stirring. Why would the HPSC be asking about our family? Her voice was carefully neutral, which meant she was either confused or hiding something. There was an incident yesterday, a villain attack I might have. Manifested something. The spoon clattered to the floor. Izuku. His mom turned around and her face had gone pale. What kind of manifestation? So he told her. Not everything. He left out the part about nearly getting killed by a monster with too many teeth. but enough. The breathing, the heat, the strange sense of knowing things he'd never learned. When he finished, his mom was quiet for a long time. "Your great-grandfather," she said finally, "on my side of the family, he was unusual." She disappeared into her bedroom and came back with a small photo album Izuku had never seen before. The pictures inside were old, black and white, with that slightly blurry quality of early camera work. "Kamado Tanjiro," she said, pointing to a man in one of the photos. "My grandfather. He lived up in the mountains, worked as a rescue specialist before quirks were properly documented." The man in the photo was tall and lean, with gentle eyes and a smile that reminded Izuku of his mom. He was standing in front of a small house, holding what looked like a long, curved blade. "Is that a sword?" Izuku asked. "A special one. He used to say it was for cutting through the darkness." His mom touched the photo gently. "He could do things, Izuku, things that people didn't understand back then. He could find lost hikers in blizzards, rescue people from avalanches. Some of the older villagers used to whisper that he could see demons. Demons, probably just wild animals. But he had this way of moving, this breathing technique." She looked at her son with eyes that were suddenly very serious. "He died when I was young, but my mother used to tell stories. She said he could make his body warm enough to melt snow, that he could move so fast he seemed to disappear." Izuku stared at the photo. The sword in his great-grandfather's hands caught the light strangely, like it was reflecting something that wasn't there. "Do you think," he said carefully, "that what's happening to me has something to do with him?" "I think," his mom said, "that some things run deeper than quirks. Some things are in the blood." That night, Izuku lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about genetic inheritance and ancestral memories and swords that cut through darkness. His right hand was warm against his chest, and in the distance, he could swear he heard the sound of someone practicing sword forms in perfect, deadly silence. "Soon," whispered the voice that might have been his great-great-grandfather. "Soon you'll be ready to learn what it really means to carry the sun." But first, Izuku thought as sleep finally claimed him, he had to figure out how to get through tomorrow's PE class without accidentally setting anything on fire. Outside his window, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. And somewhere in the city, things with gray skin and too many teeth were beginning to stir. 10 months later, Izuku stood outside the gates of UA High School with his stomach doing gymnastics routines that would make Olympic athletes jealous. The winter had been productive, if exhausting. 3 months of secret training sessions at Dagoba Beach, learning to control the heat that built in his chest when he focused on his breathing. 2 months of researching everything he could find about his great-grandfather's techniques, which turned out to be frustratingly little. And 5 months of pretending he still didn't have a quirk, while Kacchan got increasingly suspicious about why Deku suddenly didn't flinch during their conversations. The changes had been gradual enough that most people didn't notice. He stood straighter now, moved with more confidence. His stamina had improved dramatically. Turns out regulating your core body temperature made running a lot easier. And sometimes, when he concentrated, he could see things with perfect clarity, like the world had been filmed in high definition, and he'd been watching it on an old tube TV his whole life. But he still couldn't lift a car or shoot laser beams from his eyes, which meant the UA entrance exam was going to be interesting. "Midoriya," he turned to find a girl with wild pink hair and goggles pushed up on her forehead staring at him with the intensity of a mad scientist who just discovered a new element. Yes, Hatsumeme support course applicant," she said, pulling out what looked like a tablet covered in additional screens and blinking lights. "You're running about 3 degrees warmer than ambient temperature. Your breathing pattern suggests advanced respiratory control," and she squinted at the device. "You're generating trace electromagnetic signatures consistent with metabolic acceleration. What's your quirk?" Izuku blinked. "I'm sorry, what now?" "Your quirk," she waved the tablet at him. "My babies can detect all kinds of physiological anomalies. You're definitely doing something interesting with your internal systems. Temperature regulation, oxygen processing enhancement. Ooh, or maybe some kind of biothermal energy conversion." Izuku glanced around at the other applicants who were giving them a wide berth. "I guess you could call it enhanced breathing." "Breathing," Mei's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. "That's perfect. I've been working on atmospheric filtration systems and thermal regulation gear. We should totally collaborate. I could build you support equipment that amplifies your natural abilities, maybe some kind of temperature-focusing gauntlets or attention examinees." Present Mike's amplified voice cut through the crowd chatter, and Izuku felt a familiar flutter of excitement. He was actually here, at UA, about to take the entrance exam. Inside the auditorium, Present Mike explained the rules with his usual enthusiasm. 3 types of robot enemies, each worth different points. 10 minutes to rack up as many points as possible. Standard stuff, really. Except for the part where Izuku had no idea how he was going to destroy giant robots with fancy breathing techniques. A spiky-haired blonde kid a few rows down was radiating confidence like a space heater. Ka-chan, of course, looking like he owned the place already. Their eyes met for a second, and Bakugo's expression shifted to something between confusion and annoyance. He'd been giving Izuku that look a lot lately, ever since Deku had stopped reacting properly to his intimidation tactics. Plus ultra, Present Mike concluded, and the crowd began filing out toward the test sites. Battle Center B turned out to be a small city's worth of concrete buildings and narrow streets. Izuku found himself standing at the starting line next to a tall boy with dark hair and glasses who was doing warm-up stretches that looked like they belonged in a martial arts movie. Ida Tenya, the boy introduced himself with a formal bow. May the best applicant prevail, Midoriya Izuku. Good luck. The countdown began, and Izuku closed his eyes for just a moment, focusing on his breathing. In through the nose, slow and controlled. Out through the mouth, steady and even. Heat began to build in his chest, spreading down his arms and legs like warm honey. Ready? Asked the voice that had been his constant companion for the past 10 months. It was clearer now, more distinct. Sometimes he could swear he saw flashes of memories that weren't his own, mountain paths, snow-covered forests, and always, the perfect form of sword techniques he'd never learned. Ready? Izuku thought back. Gyo! The other examinees exploded forward like sprinters. Izuku took 3 steps and then paused, tilting his head slightly. Through the enhanced hearing that came with his controlled breathing state, he could pick out the mechanical whirring of robot joints, the stomp of metal feet on concrete, even the electrical hum of their power systems. Third building on the left, the ancestral voice murmured, 2-pointer on the ground floor, 3-pointer climbing the fire escape. Izuku moved, not the desperate sprint of someone trying to keep up, but the fluid, purposeful movement of someone who knew exactly where he was going. His breathing never wavered, and the heat in his chest built steadily as he approached the building. The 2-pointer was a squat, tank-like robot with rotating cannon arms. Standard anti-personnel configuration, designed to test basic combat abilities. It turned toward him with mechanical precision, weapons powering up. Izuku exhaled sharply, focusing the built-up heat down his right arm and into his palm. The air around his hand shimmered, and when his fingers made contact with the robot's chassis, metal began to glow red-hot. The internal wiring couldn't handle the thermal shock. The robot convulsed once and collapsed in a shower of sparks. 1 point, the 3-pointer on the fire escape, was trickier. It had height advantage and better mobility, plus it had already spotted him. Izuku ducked behind a parked car as laser blasts scorched the pavement where he'd been standing. Patience, whispered his great-great-grandfather's voice. Wait for the opening. The robot's firing pattern was predictable, 3 shots, pause to recalibrate, 3 more shots. During the pause, Izuku sprinted to the building's entrance and began climbing the fire escape 2 steps at a time. His breathing technique kept his muscles from burning, kept his movements smooth, and controlled even as he pushed his body harder than it had ever gone. He reached the 3rd floor just as the robot finished its recalibration cycle. For a split second, they stared at each other, boy and machine, separated by maybe 6 feet of fire escape grating. Then Izuku's left hand shot out, fingers spread wide, and exhaled a controlled burst of superheated air directly into the robot's optical sensors. The lenses cracked from thermal shock, and the robot stumbled backward, temporarily blinded. Izuku vaulted over the railing, landed on the machine's back, and pressed both palms against its neck joint. The metal began to glow, then soften, then separate as the heat overwhelmed its structural integrity. 4 points total. He was breathing harder now, and his core temperature was climbing toward uncomfortable levels, but the technique was working. Instead of trying to match the raw destructive power of other examinees' quirks, he was using precision and efficiency. Over the next 8 minutes, Izuku developed a rhythm. Scout with enhanced senses, identify weak points, apply focused heat where it would do the most damage. He avoided direct confrontations, preferring to disable robots with surgical strikes to their joints and power systems. The running tally in his head reached 27 points when he heard the scream. It came from the central plaza, where most of the other examinees had congregated to fight the higher-value robots. A girl's voice, high and panicked. Izuku changed direction without thinking, his enhanced hearing picking up the mechanical roar that meant someone was in serious trouble. The zero-pointer was exactly as advertised, a massive, building-sized robot that looked like it could step on a city block. Most of the examinees were running away from it, which was the smart tactical choice. 0 points meant it wasn't worth fighting. But there was a girl trapped under a piece of debris in its path, and the giant robot wasn't programmed to step around obstacles. Izuku's body moved before his mind caught up. He reached the plaza in 30 seconds, vaulted over the rubble pile, and dropped to his knees beside the trapped girl. She had short brown hair and wide, frightened eyes, and her leg was pinned under a concrete beam that probably weighed more than both of them combined. "Hey," he said, trying to project calm confidence while his brain screamed about the approaching robot. "I'm going to get you out of here." "My leg," she gasped. "I can't move it." "I can't, it's okay." Izuku placed his hands on the concrete beam and began to breathe, deep, controlled breaths that built heat in his core and sent it flowing down his arms. The concrete began to warm under his palms. "What's your name?" "Uraraka, Uraraka Ochako." "Nice to meet you, Uraraka, I'm Midoriya." The concrete was getting hot now, hot enough that he could smell the mineral components beginning to separate. "On 3, I want you to pull your leg free, okay? Don't worry about being gentle, just get clear." "But the beam, trust me." 1, 2, the zero-pointer's shadow fell over them. 3, Izuku exhaled every bit of built-up heat in his body directly into the concrete. The beam didn't just heat up, it began to crumble, the thermal shock fracturing its internal structure until it broke apart like chalk. Uraraka yanked her leg free with a gasp of relief, and Izuku hauled her to her feet. The zero-pointer was maybe 50 meters away now, close enough that he could see the individual panels on its armor plating. "Can you run?" he asked. "I think so, but..." The robot's foot came down where they'd been sitting 3 seconds earlier. They ran. Izuku's breathing technique was completely shot from the concrete stunt, and his internal temperature was spiking toward dangerous levels. His vision was starting to swim at the edges, and he could taste copper in his mouth. But Uraraka was keeping up, and they were gaining distance on the zero-pointer, and that was what mattered. They made it to the edge of the plaza before Izuku's legs gave out. He collapsed behind an overturned car, gasping like a fish out of water. His skin felt like he'd spent too long in a sauna, and when he touched his nose, his fingers came away red. "Midoriya," Uraraka knelt beside him, her face creased with worry. "Are you okay? What happened?" "Overheated," he managed between gasps. "Pushed too hard, need to." "Cool down." The exam buzzer sounded in the distance, which meant it was over. Izuku had no idea what his final score was, and right now he didn't care. His entire body felt like he'd been put through a blender, but Uraraka was safe, and that was worth more than any number of points. "You saved me," she said quietly. "Anyone would have done the same thing." "No," she said, and there was something fierce in her voice. "They wouldn't have. Most people ran away from that robot." "You ran toward it." Recovery girl found them there 10 minutes later, Izuku's core temperature slowly returning to normal, while Uraraka insisted on staying to make sure he was okay. The school nurse took one look at him and started muttering about reckless children and thermal exhaustion, but her expression was fond rather than annoyed. 2 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived with the UA logo on it. Izuku opened it with shaking hands, his mom hovering anxiously in the background. Inside was a small device that projected a hologram of All Might, sitting at what looked like a teacher's desk. "Young Midoriya," the hologram boomed. "Congratulations, you scored 32 villain points during the practical exam, which placed you solidly in the middle of the pack. But that's not why you're here." The projection shifted to show footage from the exam, Izuku racing toward the zero-pointer, helping Uraraka, then collapsing from exhaustion. "The entrance exam has a secret component," All Might continued. "Rescue points, awarded for heroic actions during the test. Your selfless behavior earned you 60 rescue points, giving you a total of 92 and placing you 7th overall." Izuku's mom burst into tears behind him. "But more than that," All Might's voice became more serious. "Your tactical approach impressed our faculty. You showed restraint, precision, and situational awareness far beyond your peers. These are the qualities we look for in future heroes." The hologram leaned forward, and for a moment, it felt like All Might was speaking directly to him. "Welcome to your hero academia, young Midoriya." Plus Ultra, the projection faded, leaving Izuku staring at his acceptance letter with tears streaming down his face. "You did it," whispered his ancestor's voice, warm with pride. "You chose to save others over personal glory. That is the first mark of a true demon slayer." Demon slayer? Izuku thought back, but there was no answer. Just the fading echo of approval and the promise of greater challenges ahead. That night, he called Uraraka to tell her he'd gotten in. She squealed with excitement and told him she'd made it too, thanks in part to the rescue points she'd earned helping other examinees after he'd saved her. "We're going to be classmates," she said. "This is going to be amazing." And as Izuku fell asleep that night, his acceptance letter clutched in his warm hands, he couldn't help but agree. UA High School was going to be the beginning of something extraordinary. He just hoped he was ready for it. The first thing Izuku learned about UA's hero course was that it didn't believe in easing students into anything. "Put these on," Aizawa-sensei said, tossing a blue gym uniform at him with all the enthusiasm of someone ordering a sandwich. "We're doing a quirk assessment test." It was barely 9 in the morning on his first day, and Izuku was already wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. Around him, his new classmates were chatting excitedly about finally getting to use their quirks in school. But all he could think about was how spectacularly he was about to embarrass himself. "Midoriya," Uraraka bounced over with a smile that could have powered the building. "Can you believe we're actually here? This is so exciting." "Yeah," he managed, clutching his gym uniform. Exciting? The truth was, his control had gotten better over the past few months, but it was still inconsistent. Sometimes he could maintain his enhanced state for 20 minutes without breaking a sweat. Other times, like when he was nervous or distracted, he'd overheat after 30 seconds and spend the next hour feeling like he'd been run over by a truck. And right now, with Aizawa's dead-eyed stare boring into him and the knowledge that his entire future at UA depended on this test, he was very, very nervous. The assessment itself was brutal but straightforward. 8 different physical challenges designed to showcase quirk applications. 50-meter dash, grip strength, standing long jump, repeated side steps, ball throw, distance run, sit-ups, and seated toe touch. Izuku watched his classmates tear through the challenges with a mixture of admiration and growing dread. Kacchan launched himself through the 50-meter dash with controlled explosions, finishing in under 4 seconds. A boy with engines in his calves, Ida, he remembered from the entrance exam, practically teleported down the track. A girl with gravity manipulation made the standing long jump look effortless. When his turn came for the grip strength test, Izuku closed his eyes and focused on his breathing. The familiar pattern kicked in automatically now, heat building in his chest and flowing down his arms. When he squeezed the device, he felt his muscles flood with warmth and strength he hadn't known he possessed. The display read 78 kg. Not amazing by hero standards, but respectable for someone his size. "Interesting," Aizawa murmured, making a note on his tablet. The ball throw was where things got complicated. Izuku stood in the circle with a softball in his hand and absolutely no idea how he was supposed to chuck it into the stratosphere like some of his classmates had done. He couldn't explode it like Kacchan or float it like Uraraka. His quirk was about heat and breathing and enhanced senses, none of which seemed particularly useful for making a baseball travel long distances. Unless. The thought came from that other voice, the one that sounded like ancestral wisdom filtered through decades of mountain training. Heat creates expansion. Expansion creates pressure. Pressure. Izuku took a deep breath and began building heat in his palm, but not the focused, contact-based warming he usually did. Instead, he tried to create a bubble of superheated air around the ball, a pocket of rapidly expanding gases that might give it extra velocity when he released it. He wound up and through with everything he had. The ball sailed through the air in a perfect arc, trailing faint wisps of steam. It landed with a distant thud somewhere in the middle range, not spectacular but solid. The display showed 67.4 meters. "Clever application," Aizawa said, and Izuku felt a flutter of pride. "Thermal expansion for velocity enhancement. Limited but effective." The distance run was where Izuku really started to shine. His breathing technique was perfect for endurance work, regulating his core temperature and oxygen efficiency so that he could maintain a steady pace while other students began to flag. He finished in the top 5, which felt like a minor miracle. But it was during the final challenge, seated toe touch of all things, that everything went sideways. Izuku was feeling confident by that point. His scores were solid across the board, and he was pretty sure he'd avoid the bottom ranking that would get him expelled. He approached the flexibility test with his usual breathing pattern, letting the warmth flow through his muscles to increase their elasticity. That's when the world exploded into perfect clarity. One moment he was looking at his toes, concentrating on stretching forward. The next moment he could see everything. Not just see, he could perceive every microscopic detail with crystal clarity. The individual fibers in his gym shirt, the tiny scratches on his fingernails, the precise muscle tension in Ida's face as he watched from 10 meters away. The exact trajectory of a beetle crawling across the ground behind Aizawa, but it wasn't just visual. He could hear Uraraka's heartbeat accelerating as she prepared for her own attempt. He could smell the faint traces of different soap brands from his classmates' morning showers. He could feel the electromagnetic signatures of everyone's quirks like tiny suns burning in his peripheral awareness. Transparent World, whispered the ancestral voice, and somehow Izuku knew that was exactly what this was called. See beyond the surface. Perceive the truth of all things. The sensory input was incredible, overwhelming, beautiful, and completely unsustainable for a 14-year-old brain that had never experienced anything like it. The headache hit like a sledgehammer to the skull. Izuku's vision went white around the edges, then started to tunnel. The perfect clarity collapsed into a chaos of conflicting signals, too much light, too much sound, too much everything. He tried to gasp, but his breathing pattern had completely desynchronized. Heat was building in his core with no outlet, his internal temperature spiking toward dangerous levels. He was dimly aware of hitting the ground, of someone shouting his name. The world tilted sideways, and he tasted copper as his nose started bleeding. Then everything went black. When he woke up, he was lying on a cot in the nurse's office with what felt like a construction crew doing demolition work inside his skull. Recovery Girl was puttering around nearby, muttering about reckless children and Quirk overextension. "How long was I out?" he croaked. "About 20 minutes, said a familiar voice. Ida was sitting in a chair beside his cot, still wearing his gym uniform. "You collapsed during the flexibility test. It was quite alarming." "Ida," Izuku tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as the room spun. "What are you doing here? Ensuring you recovered safely, of course." Ida's expression was serious behind his glasses. "As class representative, well, presumptive class representative, it's my duty to look after my classmates." "You don't have to, actually," Uraraka's voice came from the doorway. "We wanted to." She entered carrying a cup of water and wearing an expression of genuine concern. "That looked really scary, Midoriya. What happened?" Izuku accepted the water gratefully, using the time it took to drink to figure out how much he could explain. "Quirk overextension, I think. I pushed too hard during the test." Recovery Girl approached with her medical scanner. "Your vitals are stabilizing, but I'm seeing some unusual neural activity patterns. Enhanced sensory processing, maybe. That would explain the sudden onset migraine." "Something like that," Izuku said carefully. Recovery Girl studied her readings for another moment, then nodded. "You're cleared to return to class, but I want you to take it easy for the rest of the day. No quirk usage unless absolutely necessary." "What about my ranking?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. Am I getting expelled?" "Your overall performance was adequate," came Aizawa's dry voice from the doorway. The teacher looked like he'd been waiting there for a while. 7th out of 20 students. The expulsion threat was a logical ruse to encourage maximum effort. Relief flooded through Izuku's chest, followed immediately by confusion. 7th, but I collapsed during the last test. Your consistency across the other 7 events was impressive, Aizawa continued. Particularly your endurance performance and creative problem solving. However, his eyes narrowed slightly. We need to discuss your quirk's limitations. Collapsing from overextension is a liability in the field. Yes, sir. After Aizawa left, Ida and Uraraka helped Izuku back to the classroom for the rest of the day's orientation activities. They didn't press him for details about his quirk, which he appreciated. Instead, they filled him in on what he'd missed: homeroom assignments, schedule explanations, and Koch-chan's predictably explosive reaction to being placed second overall. "He kept looking over here while you were unconscious," Uraraka mentioned quietly. "I think he was worried, which was weird." That was weird. Koch-chan didn't worry about Deku. Koch-chan barely acknowledged Deku existed unless he needed someone to push around. The rest of the day passed in a blur of introductions and administrative details. Izuku's headache gradually faded to a dull throb, and by the time classes ended, he felt almost human again. But the experience had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. Walking home, he replayed those few seconds of perfect perception over and over in his mind. The clarity had been incredible, but the crash afterward was brutal. And 30 seconds. That was all he'd managed before his brain decided to shut down in self-defense. "You're not ready," the ancestral voice murmured. "That technique requires years of preparation, perfect mental discipline. You forced it too quickly." "Then how do I get ready?" Izuku thought back, slowly, carefully, with respect for the limits of your mortal form. That evening, Izuku sat at his desk with a fresh notebook, his Quirk development journal, as he'd started calling it. He wrote down everything he could remember about the transparent world experience. The sensory expansion, the time limit, the catastrophic feedback when he pushed too hard. Then he started making rules. Rule 1. No transparent world unless absolutely necessary. Rule 2. If I have to use it, 30 seconds maximum. Rule 3. Always have an exit strategy in case of overload. Rule 4. Ask for help when I need it. That last one was the hardest to write. He'd spent so many years being self-reliant by necessity, handling his problems alone because there was no one else to handle them. But today, Ida and Uraraka had stayed with him when he was vulnerable. They'd helped him recover, made sure he was okay, didn't ask uncomfortable questions. Maybe, for the first time in his life, he didn't have to face everything alone. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Uraraka. Ida gave me your contact info. Just wanted to check, are you feeling better?" Izuku stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Much better, thanks. And thanks for staying with me today. That meant a lot. Of course, that's what friends do, right? See you tomorrow." Friends. The word sat strangely in his mind. He'd never really had friends before, not counting his mom. But maybe that was about to change. Outside his window, the sun was setting over Musu Tafu in brilliant shades of orange and red. Somewhere in the distance, heroes were beginning their evening patrols, keeping the city safe from villains and monsters and things that hunted in the darkness. And in a small apartment, a boy with fire in his breath and the memories of ancient techniques in his blood closed his Quirk journal and started his homework, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges. But also maybe new friendships worth protecting. "Good," whispered his ancestor's voice. "A sword without a sheath will cut its wielder. Learn to balance power with wisdom, strength with restraint, and allies with trust," Izuku added silently. Yes, came the approving response. Most importantly that. 3 days into their second week at UA, Izuku was starting to think he might actually survive hero school. His classmates had stopped giving him weird looks every time he did his breathing exercises. Ida had appointed himself as an unofficial study group coordinator, which meant Izuku actually understood their homework for once. And Uraraka had started sitting with him at lunch, chatting about everything from hero rankings to her family's construction business back in Gunma. It was nice. Normal even, if you ignored the part where they were training to fight supervillains for a living. "Today we'll be doing rescue training at an off-campus facility," Aizawa announced during homeroom, looking like he'd rather be literally anywhere else. "You'll be working with 3 different hero instructors, so bring your costumes." The excitement in the room was immediate and infectious. Even Izuku felt his heart rate pick up as he thought about his hero costume. A simple green jumpsuit with thermal regulation fabric that May had helped him design. Nothing fancy, but it would let him use his Quirk without melting his clothes off. "Oh, and one more thing," Aizawa added with his trademark deadpan delivery. "Don't get killed." It would be a lot of paperwork. 20 minutes later, they were boarding a bus to the unforeseen simulation joint, also known as USJ. Izuku found himself sitting next to Asui, Kalmitsu, who had the kind of straightforward personality that made conversation surprisingly easy. "Your Quirk is pretty interesting, Ribbit," she said as the bus pulled away from UA. "I've never seen anyone use breathing techniques like that before." "It's kind of a family thing," Izuku said, which was technically true. "What about yours? The frog abilities must be useful for rescue work." Though I'm better in water than on land. What's your range limit?" It was a good question. Izuku had been testing his abilities carefully since the Quirk assessment incident, but he still didn't have solid numbers. Maybe 20 meters for enhanced senses. Less if I'm trying to maintain it for a long time. That's pretty good for reconnaissance work. Before Izuku could respond, the bus lurched to a stop. Through the windows, he could see USJ's distinctive dome structure rising ahead of them, a massive facility designed to simulate every type of disaster scenario imaginable. "All right, let's move," Aizawa called, standing up with a grunt. "Remember, this is training. Don't try to be heroes yet." The irony of that statement would become apparent approximately 30 seconds later. They filed off the bus and into USJ's main entrance, where 13, the space hero famous for rescue operations, was waiting to greet them. The facility was even more impressive from the inside. A central plaza surrounded by different disaster zones. Flood, fire, mountain rescue, urban collapse. Every nightmare scenario a hero might face, all contained under one massive dome. "Welcome to USJ," 13 said cheerfully. "Today you'll be learning about," the lights went out. In the sudden darkness, Izuku's enhanced hearing picked up sounds that made his blood run cold. Footsteps, lots of them, moving with military precision. The low hum of some kind of transportation quirk. And underneath it all, a sound like static mixed with whispers that raised every instinct his ancestor had bequeathed him. Danger, the ancient voice whispered urgently. Something wrong. Something unnatural. Stay together, Aizawa's voice cracked like a whip across the plaza. 13, get the students to safety. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting everything in harsh red shadows. And there, in the center of the plaza where nothing had been moments before, stood a writhing mass of purple-black mist. Villains began pouring through. Real villains? Kirishima's voice was tight with disbelief. Here. How did they get past UA's security? Izuku was wondering the same thing, but his attention was fixed on something else. Among the 20 or so criminals emerging from the warp gate, there was one figure that made every instinct he'd inherited scream warnings. It looked human at first glance, tall, muscular, wearing pants but no shirt. But its skin had a grayish pallor that reminded Izuku uncomfortably of the creature from that night 10 months ago. And when it turned its head, scanning the facility with predatory interest, its eyes reflected the emergency lighting like an animal's. Hybrid, his ancestor's voice was grim, demon essence fused with human form. More dangerous than either alone, a chill ran down Izuku's spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Listen up, the man made of purple mist spoke with a cultured voice that was somehow more terrifying than any villainous monologue. We are the League of Villains. We have come here today to kill All Might. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Aizawa launched himself into the crowd of villains with his capture weapon deployed. His quirk erased the abilities of everyone he looked at, leveling the playing field through pure skill and determination. But the hybrid creature didn't seem affected. 13, Aizawa shouted without taking his eyes off his opponents. Get the students out of here and contact the school. Right, 13 began herding Class 1A toward the exit, but the mist villain was faster. I don't think so, the shadow said pleasantly, and suddenly the exit was blocked by swirling darkness. We can't have you calling for help, can we? Now let me scatter you across the facility. The mist expanded, reaching for them with tendrils of shadow. Izuku felt the cold touch of the warp quirk beginning to envelope him. His breathing technique kicked in automatically, heat flaring in his chest and spreading down his limbs. The warmth seemed to disrupt whatever spatial manipulation the villain was trying to use. Instead of being scattered randomly, Izuku felt himself pulled toward one specific zone. He materialized in the flood simulation area, waist-deep in artificial water that was shockingly cold. Around him, he could hear splashing and voices, other students who'd been warped to the same location. Everyone okay? That was Ida's voice, thank God. Present, Uraraka called from somewhere to his left. Here, Ribbit, Sue sounded calm, which made sense given her amphibious nature. Same. That was Mineta, the purple-haired boy who'd been making inappropriate comments since day one. 5 students total then. In a zone specifically designed to test water rescue scenarios, which meant, look out below. The villains assigned to the flood zone were aquatic specialists, as expected. 3 of them breached the surface like sharks, moving through the water with predatory grace. One had gills and shark-like teeth. Another appeared to be part octopus, with tentacles instead of legs. The third was completely covered in scales and moved like a human torpedo. Stay together, Ida commanded, his engines sputtering uselessly in the deep water. Tsu, can you get us to higher ground? Not all at once, Ribbit. And they're faster in the water than I am. The shark-toothed villain was already closing in on Mineta, who was flailing desperately and making small, terrified sounds. Izuku didn't think, he just moved. His breathing technique let him regulate his core temperature even in the cold water, and the enhanced physical coordination kept him from floundering like his classmates. He reached Mineta just as the villain's jaws opened wide, interposing himself between predator and prey. Hey, he called to the villain, pick on someone your own size. The shark man laughed, showing rows of needle-sharp teeth. You think you can fight in my element, little hero? Let's find out. Izuku took the deepest breath of his life and began building heat, not the focused, contact-based warming he usually used, but something broader. He let the thermal energy spread through the water around him, creating currents of heated liquid that disrupted the villain's smooth swimming motion. It wasn't much. He couldn't boil the entire flood zone, but it was enough to make the villain hesitate. Tsu, he called, can you get the others to the boat? There was a rescue vessel moored at the edge of the zone, probably part of the normal training setup. If they could reach it, they'd have a stable platform to work from. On it, ribbit! Tsu's tongue shot out, wrapping around Uraraka's waist and yanking her toward safety. Ida activated his engines in short bursts, using them like a jet ski to propel himself through the water. Mineta clung to Izuku's back like a particularly pathetic backpack. But the villains weren't going to just let them escape. The octopus man had been circling around behind them, and now he struck with all 8 tentacles at once. Izuku barely managed to twist away from the first few, but there were too many to dodge completely. A powerful tentacle wrapped around his ankle and yanked him under. The world went dark and cold. Water flooded his nose and mouth, and for a panicked moment, he was just another drowning victim in a disaster simulation gone wrong. The villain's tentacles were like steel cables, impossible to break with physical strength alone. Focus, his ancestor's voice cut through the panic. Water conducts heat. Use it, of course. Izuku stopped struggling and started breathing, or rather, started the breathing pattern while holding what air he had left. The heat built in his chest, then flowed down his arms into the water around him. The temperature change wasn't dramatic by human standards, maybe 10 degrees. But for a villain whose physiology was adapted to cold water, it was like being plunged into a hot bath. The tentacles loosened just enough for Izuku to wrench himself free and kick toward the surface. He breached, gasping, treading water while his classmates called his name from the rescue boat. But the villains were regrouping, and he was still in the middle of their territory. Coordinate, the ancestral voice suggested. Your breathing can sync with others, use it. Izuku had never tried that before, but he didn't have time to doubt. He began breathing in a slow, steady rhythm, not his usual heat-building pattern, but something calmer, more universal. Everyone match my breathing, he called to his classmates. Deep breath in, hold, slow breath out. It sounded crazy, but somehow it worked. Within seconds, all 5 of them were breathing in perfect synchronization. And with that shared rhythm came something unexpected, enhanced coordination. When Tsu moved to rescue him, he was already swimming toward her tongue. When Ida fired his engines to confuse the villains, the timing was perfect. They fought as a unit, each student's quirk complementing the others in ways that should have taken months of training to achieve. Tsu's mobility, Yoriichi's gravity manipulation, Ida's speed, even Mineta's sticky spheres, all coordinated through the simple act of breathing together. The aquatic villains didn't stand a chance. By the time they'd subdued all 3 criminals and made it to the rescue boat, Izuku was exhausted but exhilarated. The breathing coordination technique had worked better than he'd dared hope. How did you do that? Uraraka asked, wringing water from her costume. The breathing thing, I mean, it felt like we could read each other's minds. I'm not sure, Izuku admitted. It's part of my quirk, I think. Enhanced rhythm coordination. From the boat, they could see the central plaza where Aizawa was still fighting. The teacher was holding his own against the crowd of villains, but Izuku could see him slowing down. Erasure quirk or not, there were limits to what one person could do against those odds. And the hybrid creature hadn't joined the fight yet. It was just standing there, watching Aizawa with those inhuman eyes like it was waiting for something. We have to help him, Ida said, his hand tightening on the boat's railing. Our job is to stay safe and not get in the way, Tsu pointed out pragmatically. But a sound echoed across the facility that made everyone freeze. It was like thunder, if thunder could be filled with malice and hunger. The hybrid had finally moved, launching itself at Aizawa with impossible speed. The teacher barely got his capture weapon up in time to block claws that could have torn through steel. The impact sent him skidding backward across the plaza floor, and when he looked up, there was blood on his face. Dawn, Izuku realized, looking up at the facility's transparent dome. The first rays of sunlight were beginning to filter through the artificial skylights, painting everything in shades of gold and orange. Now his ancestor's voice was urgent, while the light grows strong. That thing will be weaker in the sun. I have to go, Izuku said, standing up in the boat. What? Uraraka grabbed his arm. Midoriya, you can't, it's too dangerous. That thing isn't just a villain, he said, looking at the hybrid as it circled Aizawa like a predator playing with wounded prey. It's something else, something wrong, and I think I might be the only one here who can fight it. It sounded insane when he said it out loud, but the ancestral memories were clear. Creatures like this had been fought before by people with techniques like his. Fire and breath and blade cutting through darkness with the power of the sun. He didn't have a blade, but he had fire and breath and the growing light of dawn. It would have to be enough. Keep breathing together, he told his classmates as he prepared to dive back into the water. Stay coordinated, and if I don't make it back, you will, Ida said firmly. Because that's what heroes do. Izuku nodded once, then dove. The swim to the central plaza was the longest of his life. By the time he hauled himself out of the flood zone and onto the main floor, his costume was soaked, and his core temperature was spiking from the effort of maintaining his breathing technique while swimming. But the sunlight streaming through the dome felt warm on his face, and the hybrid creature was starting to look less solid than it had in the shadows. Aizawa was on one knee, his capture weapon torn and his left arm hanging at an odd angle. The hybrid loomed over him, claws extended for a killing blow. "Hey!" Izuku shouted, and his voice carried further than it should have in the vast space. "Remember me?" The creature's head snapped around, and for a moment its reflecting eyes met his across the plaza. There was intelligence there, but also something hungry and alien that made Izuku's skin crawl. Then it smiled with too many teeth, abandoned Aizawa, and came for him instead. The charge was faster than anything human should have been able to move. But Izuku's transparent world training, brief as it was, let him track the creature's approach with perfect clarity. He could see the exact angle of its leap, the precise timing of its claw strike, the micro-adjustments it made midair. More importantly, he could see the way the growing sunlight seemed to burn at its edges, making its form waver like heat mirages. Instead of dodging, Izuku stepped forward and breathed. The heat that built in his chest was different this time, not just his own thermal energy, but something borrowed from the dawn light streaming through the dome. He exhaled sharply, and the air around his hands shimmered with concentrated warmth. His palm met the creature's forehead in the exact same spot he'd touched that first monster 10 months ago. The hybrid's momentum stopped like it had hit a wall. Where Izuku's skin made contact, steam rose in thick clouds, and the thing's gray flesh began to crack and blacken. It staggered backward with a sound like breaking glass, shaking its head frantically. "More," his ancestor urged. While the light is strong, Izuku pressed his advantage, following the creature's retreat with steady breathing and reaching hands. Each touch left scorched handprints on its skin. Each exhalation filled the air with burning mist that made the hybrid flinch away, but the effort was taking its toll. His core temperature was climbing toward dangerous levels, and black spots were starting to dance at the edges of his vision. How long could he keep this up? That's when the door exploded inward, and All Might arrived like a force of nature made flesh. "I am here," the #1 hero announced, and even the hybrid seemed to hesitate at the sound of that voice. But All Might's attention wasn't on the creature. His eyes were fixed on Izuku specifically, on the way the boy was standing between a wounded teacher and a monster, steam rising from his hands and sunlight gleaming on his determined face. That, All Might thought, is what a true hero looks like. The rest of the fight was a blur. All Might engaged the hybrid directly while Izuku helped get Aizawa to safety. The creature was powerful, but even demon-enhanced physiology couldn't stand up to the symbol of peace in full fury. Within minutes, it was over. As the authorities arrived to clean up the aftermath, Izuku found himself sitting on the plaza steps with an ice pack pressed to his overheated forehead. His classmates were clustered around him, everyone talking at once about what had happened. But All Might approached alone, crouching down to Izuku's eye level with that familiar smile. "Young Midoriya," he said quietly, "that was quite an impressive display. Putting yourself in harm's way to protect your teacher, that takes real courage." "Anyone would have done the same thing," Izuku mumbled, the same response he'd given after the entrance exam. "No," All Might said seriously. "They wouldn't have. You ran toward danger when others would run away, you coordinated your classmates in the middle of a crisis, and you fought that creature with a power I've never seen before." His smile widened slightly. "I think we need to have a conversation, you and I, about what it really means to be a hero." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, painting USJ in shades of gold and hope, Izuku felt something shift in his chest. Not heat this time, but a warm certainty that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. The Age of Heroes was just beginning, and maybe, just maybe, he was going to be part of it. The UA Sports Festival was, without question, the most terrifying thing Izuku had ever volunteered for. 2 weeks after USJ, he stood in the competitor tunnel beneath the stadium, listening to the roar of 50,000 people and trying not to throw up on his gym shoes. Around him, his classmates were dealing with pre-competition nerves in their own ways. Ida was doing stretches that looked like they belonged in a yoga magazine. Uraraka was bouncing on her toes and muttering what sounded like a pep talk to herself. Even Kachan looked tense, his hands sparking with small explosions. "You okay?" Tsu asked, appearing beside him with her usual straightforward concern. "You look a little green." "Well, greener than usual." Just nerves, Izuku managed, wiping sweat from his palms. The irony wasn't lost on him that someone whose quirk involved heat regulation was sweating from anxiety. The whole country's watching, Mineta whimpered from somewhere behind them. What if I mess up? What if I embarrass myself on live television? Then you'll have company, Tokoyami said dryly. Few of us are ready for this level of scrutiny. That was the problem, really. The sports festival wasn't just a school competition, it was a showcase for the entire hero industry. Pro heroes, agency scouts, government officials, and millions of citizens would be watching every move they made. One mistake, one moment of weakness, and it would be broadcast across Japan. No pressure at all. May I have your attention? Present Mike's amplified voice echoed through the tunnel. Introducing the first-year students of UA High School's hero course. The tunnel doors slid open, revealing the massive stadium beyond. Sunlight streamed down from the open roof, and the noise hit them like a physical wall. Izuku took a deep breath, his usual calming pattern, and felt heat begin to build in his chest. The warmth was reassuring, a reminder that he had tools to handle whatever came next. Ready? His ancestor's voice asked. As I'll ever be, Izuku thought back. They marched into the arena as a group, Class 1A leading the parade of first-year students. The crowd noise was deafening, but Izuku found himself focusing on smaller sounds. The rustle of fabric as his classmates walked, the soft whistle of wind through the stadium's architecture, the distant hum of camera equipment capturing every moment. Present Mike introduced them with his usual enthusiasm, but Izuku barely heard the words. He was too busy studying the competition. Students from the general education courses, support courses, business courses, all of them hoping to prove they belonged in the hero track. Some looked nervous, others confident, a few downright predatory. Then Midnight took the stage to explain the first event, and Izuku's attention snapped back to the present. For the preliminary round, the R-rated hero announced with her trademark sultry smile, we'll be having an obstacle race. All participants will compete simultaneously in a 4-kilometer circuit around the stadium. The first 42 students to cross the finish line advance to the next round, an obstacle race. Izuku could work with that. His breathing technique was perfect for endurance events, and his enhanced coordination would help with whatever challenges they threw at him. Oh, and one more thing, Midnight added with a wicked grin. This course is designed to test more than just speed. You'll need strategy, creativity, and a little bit of luck to make it through. The starting signal was a gunshot that echoed across the stadium. Immediately, the 1,000-plus students surged forward toward the tunnel exit and immediately ran into the first obstacle. The tunnel was only wide enough for maybe 8 people to pass through comfortably. With over 1,000 students trying to squeeze through at once, it became a bottleneck nightmare. Bodies pressed together, quirks activated in desperation, and the air filled with shouts and the smell of sweat. Izuku had been expecting something like this. Instead of joining the crush at ground level, he'd positioned himself near the tunnel wall where there was a maintenance ladder. While everyone else fought for position, he climbed. The tunnel ceiling had service walkways designed for maintenance crews. They were narrow and definitely not intended for student use, but they were also completely empty. Izuku pulled himself up and began running along the metal grating, his breathing technique keeping his movements light and coordinated. Below him, the crowd was still struggling to get through the main passage. Above, he had a clear path to the exit. Clever, his ancestor approved. Think beyond the obvious route. Izuku emerged from the tunnel in the top 15, well ahead of most of his classmates. The second obstacle was immediately visible. A massive ice field created by some kind of refrigeration system, with robotic enemies scattered across the frozen landscape. The robots were the same models from the entrance exam, but that wasn't the real challenge. The real challenge was the ice itself, slick and treacherous and cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Most students would struggle with the temperature. Their quirks would be less effective, their movements slower and more cautious. But Izuku's breathing technique was specifically designed for thermal regulation. He stepped onto the ice field and began building heat in his core, letting it flow through his body in controlled waves. His feet stayed warm enough to maintain traction, his hands flexible enough to grab and climb. The cold that was slowing down other competitors barely affected him. The robots were actually easier to deal with than during the entrance exam. Instead of trying to destroy them outright, he used focused heat to disable their joints and sensors. A quick touch to a knee joint would cause the metal to expand and seize up. A breath of superheated air across their optical array would crack the lenses from thermal shock. Efficient, precise, and it conserved energy for whatever came next. By the time he reached the third obstacle, a minefield disguised as an innocent-looking field of dirt, he was in the top 10. The explosives were small, designed to slow students down rather than seriously injure them, but they were densely packed and nearly impossible to see. Most of the leaders were being extremely cautious, testing each step before committing their weight. But Izuku's enhanced hearing could pick up the subtle electromagnetic signatures of the buried mines. Not perfectly, his sensory abilities weren't quite that refined yet, but well enough to plot a safer path through the field. He was picking his way carefully through the explosives when a familiar shock of red and white hair caught his attention. Todoroki was moving through the minefield like he owned it, creating ice paths that triggered the mines at a safe distance while simultaneously giving him an elevated route to run on. Smart, powerful, and completely consistent with what Izuku had observed about his classmate over the past month. Shoto Todoroki was probably the strongest student in their class, and he knew it. His quirk was perfectly balanced, his control was excellent, and he had the kind of natural talent that made other people question their life choices. But there was something cold about him beyond just his ice powers, a distance that went deeper than mere personality. Izuku had tried talking to him a few times, but Todoroki responded to most social overtures with polite disinterest. He worked with classmates when required, but never seemed to enjoy it. Like he was going through the motions of being part of a team while keeping his real thoughts locked away. Right now, though, Todoroki was pulling ahead. His ice path strategy was letting him move faster than anyone else could manage through the minefield. If Izuku wanted to keep up, don't try to match his power, his ancestor advised. Use your advantages. Izuku nodded to himself and shifted tactics. Instead of trying to avoid the mines entirely, he started deliberately triggering them, but only the ones that were far enough away to be safe. Each explosion created a small crater and cleared a patch of ground that he knew was mine-free. It was louder and more dramatic than Todoroki's approach, but it worked. By the time they reached the finish line, Izuku was less than 10 meters behind the ice user, crossing in solid second place. The crowd went wild. Present Mike was shouting something about strategic brilliance and innovative thinking, but Izuku was too busy catching his breath to pay attention. His core temperature was slightly elevated from the thermal regulation work, but nothing like the dangerous spikes he'd experienced during his early training. He was getting better at this. Impressive performance, Todoroki said, appearing beside him with his usual emotionless expression. Your quirk is more versatile than I initially assessed. Thanks, Izuku said, still breathing a little hard. Your ice paths were brilliant. I couldn't have kept up without the mind strategy. Something flickered across Todoroki's face, surprise maybe, like he wasn't used to other students acknowledging his abilities without resentment. The preliminary round is complete, Midnight announced, drawing their attention back to the arena. Our 42 finalists will now compete in the second event, a cavalry battle. The rules were more complex this time. Teams of 4 with point values assigned based on preliminary placement. Steal points from other teams by taking their headbands, defend your own points, last 15 minutes. The top 4 teams advance to the final tournament bracket. As the second place finisher, Izuku had 10 million points painted on his forehead. 10 million, he muttered, watching every other student in the arena turn to stare at him with predatory interest. This is going to be fun. Finding teammates turned out to be easier than expected. Uraraka volunteered immediately, followed by Ida, who declared that supporting his classmate was the proper thing to do. For their 4th member, they recruited Hatsume Mei from the support course, who was more interested in showcasing her inventions than winning points. Don't worry, Mei announced, strapping various gadgets to their costumes. My babies will give us the mobility advantage we need. Her babies turned out to be jetpack boots, electromagnetic grappling hooks, and something she called a thermal enhancement array that she'd specifically designed for Izuku after studying his quirk during the entrance exam. It focuses your heat generation into specific channels, she explained, adjusting the device's settings. Should extend your effective range and reduce the energy cost of sustained thermal regulation. Izuku strapped on the gear with a mixture of gratitude and terror. Mei's inventions were brilliant, but they had a tendency to explode at inconvenient moments. The cavalry battle was chaos from the opening horn. Every team immediately went after Izuku's 10 million points, converging on their position like a pack of wolves. But Mei's mobility gear worked perfectly, letting them stay airborne and out of reach, while Izuku used controlled heat bursts to discourage pursuit. The real challenge came when Todoroki's team made their play. They approached with tactical precision, Todoroki creating ice barriers to limit escape routes while his teammates provided support and distraction. Within minutes, Izuku's team was cornered against the arena wall with nowhere to run. "Give me the headband," Todoroki said calmly, ice crystals forming around his left hand. "This doesn't have to be difficult." "Sorry," Izuku replied, settling into his breathing pattern and feeling heat build in his chest. "But I'm not giving up that easily." What followed was less a battle than a demonstration of opposing philosophies. Todoroki fought with overwhelming power and perfect control, creating massive ice structures and filling the air with freezing mist. His attacks were devastating, precise, and utterly relentless. Anyone else would have been defeated in seconds. But Izuku didn't fight like anyone else. Instead of trying to match Todoroki's raw output, he focused on precision and efficiency. Every breath was perfectly timed, every movement calculated for maximum effect. When ice walls rose to block his path, he didn't try to smash through them. He heeded specific stress points until the structures cracked and collapsed. When freezing air threatened to overwhelm his team, he created thermal barriers that deflected the worst of the cold. "Incredible," Present Mike's voice echoed across the arena. "Young Midoriya is using some kind of breathing-based thermal regulation to counter Todoroki's ice attacks. I've never seen anything like it." The crowd was on its feet, but Izuku barely noticed. He was in the zone now, completely focused on the rhythm of breath and heat and movement. This was what his ancestor had been trying to teach him, not just power, but perfect control over that power. Todoroki was strong, but strength without strategy was just destruction. And destruction, by itself, couldn't win this fight. The turning point came when Todoroki overcommitted to a massive ice attack that left his right side exposed. Izuku darted in, using Mei's grappling system to get inside the other boy's guard, and placed his palm against Todoroki's shoulder. Not to hurt him, just to prove a point. "Your ice is impressive," Izuku said quietly, his hand warm against Todoroki's costume. "But it's not the only tool you have, is it?" Todoroki's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment his perfect composure cracked. "What are you talking about? Your father is Endeavor, right? The flame hero. I've been wondering why you never use fire attacks." The effect of those words was immediate and dramatic. Todoroki jerked backward like he'd been slapped, ice crystals forming chaotically around his body. His breathing became rapid and shallow, and his left hand began to smoke with suppressed flames. "Don't," he said, and his voice was raw with something that might have been pain. "Don't talk about him." The cavalry battle ended a few minutes later with Izuku's team still in possession of most of their points. They'd qualified for the finals, along with teams led by Bakugo, Todoroki, and Shinso from general education. But as the arena cleared for the lunch break, Izuku found himself thinking about the look in Todoroki's eyes when he'd mentioned Endeavor. There was a story there, something painful and complicated that went beyond normal family dynamics. He found Todoroki sitting alone in one of the stadium's quieter corridors, staring at his hands with an expression of deep confusion. "Hey," Izuku said, settling down beside him. "You okay? Why did you say that?" Todoroki asked without looking up. "About my father, about fire." Izuku was quiet for a moment, organizing his thoughts. "Because I know what it's like to inherit something you're not sure you want. My quirk. It comes from my family too. Sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's life instead of my own." That got Todoroki's attention. He turned to study Izuku with those mismatched eyes, and for the first time since they'd met, his expression showed genuine curiosity. "Your breathing techniques," Todoroki said slowly. "They're not modern quirk applications, are they? They're older, traditional. My great-great-grandfather, he was a rescue specialist in the mountains before quirks were properly documented. The techniques, they come from him. Sometimes I feel like I'm just carrying on his work instead of doing something that's actually mine." Todoroki was quiet for a long time, processing this information. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "My father bought my mother's family for their ice quirk. He wanted to create the perfect hero, someone who could use both fire and ice without limitations." Todoroki's left hand clenched into a fist, and small flames began to dance between his fingers. But she couldn't handle the pressure. The training, the constant pushing to be something she never wanted to be. What happened to her? Hospital. She's been there for years. The flames guttered out, replaced by frost that spread across Todoroki's knuckles. "I swore I'd never use his power, never become the weapon he wanted me to be." Izuku watched the interplay of ice and suppressed fire with growing understanding. "But it's your power too, isn't it? Not just his, is it? Todoroki's laugh was bitter. How can I tell where he ends and I begin? Good question, Izuku's ancestor murmured. One every inheritor must answer for themselves. I think, Izuku said carefully, that power doesn't care where it comes from. It only cares how you choose to use it. He held up his own hand, letting wisps of steam rise from his palm. My great-great-grandfather used these techniques to save people in the mountains. I'm using them to become a hero. Same power, different purpose. Different purpose, Todoroki repeated, like he was testing how the words felt. Your fire doesn't belong to Endeavor any more than my breathing belongs to my ancestor. It's just a tool. What matters is what you build with it. The conversation was interrupted by Present Mike announcing the start of the final tournament bracket. As they walked back toward the arena, Todoroki seemed lighter somehow, less burdened by whatever weight he'd been carrying. Midoriya, he said as they reached the competitor area. Thank you for understanding. Thank you for trusting me with the story. The tournament bracket had them matched against each other in the semifinals, assuming they both made it that far. Looking at Todoroki now, still conflicted, but no longer actively fighting half of his own power, Izuku suspected that fight was going to be very different from their cavalry battle. He was right. When they finally faced each other in the semifinal match, Todoroki came at him with everything he had. Ice and fire working in perfect harmony, creating attacks that were both devastating and beautiful. The arena floor became a landscape of frozen flames and burning ice, temperatures swinging from Arctic to desert in seconds. But Izuku was ready for it. His breathing technique let him adapt to each temperature shift, regulating his core heat to match whatever conditions Todoroki created. When the air filled with freezing mist, he became a furnace. When waves of flame swept across the arena, he became a heat sink that absorbed and redirected the thermal energy. Amazing! Present Mike was practically screaming with excitement. Midoriya's breathing-based thermal regulation is letting him adapt to Todoroki's combination attacks in real time. I've never seen anything like this before, neither had Izuku, honestly. This was the first time he'd pushed his quirk to its absolute limits, and it was responding better than he'd ever dreamed. Every breath brought perfect control over his internal temperature. Every exhale let him shape the thermal environment around him. For the first time since discovering his abilities, he felt truly confident in what he could do. The match ended when both fighters pushed themselves past their limits simultaneously. Todoroki's combination attack created a thermal vortex that should have been impossible to counter, but Izuku's response, a perfectly controlled explosion of superheated air, disrupted the vortex's formation and sent both of them flying. They landed at opposite edges of the arena, both too exhausted to continue. Double knockout, Midnight announced. Both fighters are unable to continue. The crowd's applause was deafening, but all Izuku could hear was his ancestor's voice, warm with pride. Well done, the ancient presence whispered. You have learned to master both power and restraint. That is the true mark of a warrior. Later, after the medals ceremony and the closing speeches, Izuku found himself walking out of the stadium with his bronze medal and a head full of professional scout offers. The media attention was overwhelming. Reporters wanted to know about his unique breathing-based fighting style and how he developed such precise thermal control. But the moment that mattered most came when All Might approached him in the corridor outside the competitor area. Young Midoriya, the symbol of peace, said, his characteristic smile somehow more serious than usual. I've been watching your progress with great interest. That performance today, it was the work of someone who truly understands what it means to be a hero. Thank you, All Might. That means everything coming from you. I wonder, All Might continued, if you might have time for a conversation. There's something I'd like to discuss with you about power and responsibility and the kind of legacy we leave behind. As they walked out of the stadium together, Izuku couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. The sports festival had been a test of his abilities, but somehow he suspected it had also been an audition. For what, he wasn't quite sure yet, but he was ready to find out. The sun grows stronger, his ancestor observed as they stepped out into the late afternoon light. Soon, you will be ready for the greater challenges that await. What kind of challenges? Izuku wondered. But there was no answer, just the warm certainty that whatever came next, he would face it with friends by his side and fire in his breath. The Age of Heroes was calling, and this time, he was ready to answer. 3 days after the sports festival, Izuku found himself sitting across from All Might at a small cafe near Dagoba Beach, trying not to have a panic attack. The #1 hero had insisted on meeting somewhere casual and private. which apparently meant a family restaurant where the waitresses kept sneaking glances at their table and whispering to each other behind the coffee machine. All Might was doing his best to look inconspicuous, but there was no disguise in the world that could hide those shoulders or that unmistakable smile. "You're probably wondering why I asked to meet," All Might said, stirring sugar into his coffee with the careful precision of someone who is used to breaking things accidentally. "A little," Izuku admitted. His own cup sat untouched, steam rising from the surface in patterns that reminded him of his breathing exercises. "I mean, I'm honored that you wanted to talk, but young Midoriya," All Might interrupted gently, "what I'm about to tell you must remain absolutely confidential." "Can I trust you with that?" The seriousness in his tone made Izuku sit up straighter. "Of course, All Might, whatever you need." All Might was quiet for a moment, studying Izuku's face like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Then he leaned forward, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "My quirk isn't what people think it is," Izuku blinked. "I'm sorry, One for All, that's its real name. It's not a strength enhancement quirk that I was born with." All Might's hands were steady on his coffee cup, but there was something vulnerable in his expression. "It's something that can be passed down, from person to person. A power that grows stronger with each generation." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything Izuku thought he knew about the world. Quirks weren't transferable. Everyone learned that in elementary school, you got what you were born with, and that was it. The idea that someone could just give their power to someone else was fundamentally impossible, except All Might wasn't lying. Izuku could tell from the way he held himself, the quiet certainty in his voice. This was truth, however impossible it seemed. "I've been looking for a successor," All Might continued. "Someone worthy to inherit One for All when I can no longer carry it. And after watching your performance at the sports festival, your actions during the USJ incident, your behavior during the entrance exam." He smiled, and it was different from his usual media-friendly grin. "Warmer, more personal, I believe that person might be you." Izuku's brain stuttered to a halt. "Me," the word came out as barely a squeak. "But I already have a quirk, and it's not exactly standard hero material." "Your sunborn quirk is remarkable," All Might said firmly. "The thermal regulation, the enhanced coordination, the way you used it to save your classmates and protect your teacher. But more than that, you've shown the heart of a true hero. You run toward danger when others run away. You put others' safety before your own glory." "Anyone would." "No, they wouldn't." All Might's interruption was gentle but absolute. "I've been doing this for decades, young Midoriya. I've seen countless heroes, both professional and aspiring. Most of them are good people with noble intentions. But very few have that instinctive drive to save others at personal cost. You do." Izuku stared down at his untouched coffee, mind racing. "One for All, a transferable quirk that could be passed down through generations. And All Might thought he was worthy of it. What would happen to my current quirk?" he asked quietly. "That's complicated," All Might admitted. "One for All has been combined with other quirks before, but never with something like yours. Your sunborn abilities seem to have deep historical roots, almost like they're connected to something beyond modern quirk science." "You have no idea," Izuku's ancestor whispered dryly. "The integration might be seamless," All Might continued, "or it might be challenging. There's only one way to find out." He reached across the table, placing his hand over Izuku's. "But I want you to know, this decision is entirely yours. I'm offering you One for All because of who you are now, not because of what additional power might make you." Izuku looked up into All Might's eyes, kind, honest, and absolutely certain. The symbol of peace, the man who'd inspired him to dream of becoming a hero in the first place, was offering him the chance to carry on that legacy. "What do you think?" he asked his ancestor silently. "Power without wisdom is dangerous," came the thoughtful response. "But you have shown wisdom beyond your years, and this man, his intentions are pure. He seeks not a weapon but a protector. Then you think I should accept?" "I think," his ancestor said slowly, "that some burdens are meant to be shared. You carry my legacy. Perhaps it is time you carried another's as well." Izuku took a deep breath, feeling heat build in his chest in the familiar, comforting pattern. "Yes," he said, "I'll do it. I want to be worthy of One for All." All Might's smile could have powered the entire city. "You already are, my boy, you already are." The transfer itself was surprisingly anticlimactic. All Might plucked one of his own hairs, handed it to Izuku, and told him to eat it. "That's definitely not what I expected," Izuku said, staring at the blonde hair. "The quirk is passed through DNA," All Might explained. "I know it's unusual, but no, it's fine, just different." Izuku put the hair in his mouth and swallowed before he could think too hard about it. How long before, the power hit him like a freight train. It started as a warmth in his stomach, different from his usual thermal generation. Where his sunborn quirk felt like controlled fire, this was more like lightning, electric, immediate, and vast beyond comprehension. He could feel it spreading through his body, seeking connection points, trying to integrate with his existing abilities. And that's where things went wrong. His sunborn quirk operated on rhythm, controlled breathing, steady heat generation, precise thermal regulation. It was organic, flowing, designed to work in harmony with natural body processes. One for All was raw power looking for an outlet. It wanted to enhance everything at once, flood his muscles with strength, supercharge his reflexes, turn him into a living weapon of overwhelming force. The two power systems met somewhere in his chest and immediately began fighting each other. Izuku doubled over as competing energies tore through his body. His breathing pattern shattered, thermal regulations spiraling out of control. His core temperature spiked toward dangerous levels, while simultaneously his muscles began cramping from the unfamiliar power coursing through them. Midoriya, All Might was beside him instantly, one massive hand on his shoulder. "What's happening? Talk to me." "Can't," Izuku gasped, feeling like his entire circulatory system was being rewired while he was still using it. "Powers aren't syncing." His right arm erupted in green lightning, crackling with One for All's energy. At the same time, steam began pouring from his left hand as his sunborn quirk went into overdrive, trying to compensate for the thermal chaos in his system. The competing energies met at his spine and sent him convulsing to the cafe floor. "Stop!" His ancestor's voice was urgent. "Both powers at once will destroy you. Choose one or the other, not both." But it was too late for choice. The powers were already integrated at a cellular level, and now they were trying to occupy the same space in his nervous system. Izuku's vision went white as every nerve in his body fired simultaneously, and then everything went dark. He woke up in the hospital 3 hours later with Recovery Girl hovering over him and the worst headache of his life. "Quirk integration syndrome," she announced, making notes on a clipboard. "I've seen it before, though never quite this severe. Your body was trying to adapt to two completely different power systems at the same time." "Is he going to be okay?" All Might's voice tight with worry. "Physically, yes, with time. I've healed the worst of the cellular damage, but there's still significant strain on his nervous system and muscular structure. He'll need at least a week of complete rest before any quirk usage." Izuku tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as every muscle in his body screamed in protest. "What about, can I still use both quirks?" Recovery Girl's expression was grave. "That remains to be seen. Right now, your body is treating them as conflicting systems. Until you learn to synchronize them properly, attempting to use both at once could cause permanent damage." The next week was the longest of Izuku's life. He spent most of it lying in bed, feeling like he'd been put through a blender and reassembled by someone who wasn't entirely sure how humans were supposed to work. Every time he tried to use his breathing techniques, he could feel One for All stirring in response, and the resulting power clash left him dizzy and nauseous. His mom fussed over him constantly, bringing him soup and magazines and trying not to let him see how worried she was. But Izuku could tell she was scared, not just of his condition, but of the implications. Her son had somehow acquired a second quirk, and the process had nearly killed him. "I'm fine, Mom," he said for the 100th time, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "You collapsed in public," she replied, adjusting his blankets with unnecessary precision. Recovery Girl said it was quirk integration syndrome. How does someone just integrate a second quirk? Izuku had been dreading this conversation. All Might had sworn him to secrecy about One for All's true nature, which meant he couldn't explain what had really happened. But his mom deserved some version of the truth. I think my sunborn quirk is more complicated than we realized," he said carefully. "Maybe it was always meant to work with other abilities. Like a compatibility thing. It wasn't entirely a lie. His ancestors' techniques were designed to enhance natural human capabilities, so maybe they could enhance quirk abilities too. The problem was figuring out how to make them work together instead of fighting each other." On the 5th day of his medical leave, Izuku got a visitor he wasn't expecting. Todoroki, he struggled to sit up as his classmate entered the hospital room, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "Midoriya," Todoroki nodded formally, then seemed to run out of words. He stood there for a moment, studying Izuku's face with that odd intensity he sometimes got. "I heard about your condition, quirk integration syndrome. Yeah, it's been interesting. I wanted to apologize." The words came out in a rush, like Todoroki had been practicing them. Our fight at the sports festival. I pushed you too hard, used too much power. If that contributed to your current situation, it didn't, Izuku interrupted quickly. This is something else entirely. You don't need to apologize for fighting your best. Todoroki was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Then, the way you spoke to me during the cavalry battle, about using both sides of my power, about making it my own instead of my father's. I've been thinking about that conversation. Good thoughts, I hope. Difficult thoughts, Todoroki corrected. But necessary ones. I've been so focused on rejecting my father's influence that I forgot my power doesn't belong to him anymore. It belongs to me, and I get to choose what to do with it. He pulled a chair up beside Izuku's bed, settling into it with careful precision. I've been working on combination techniques. Fire and ice together, like you suggested. It's challenging. The two elements don't want to coexist peacefully. Izuku laughed, though it came out a little bitter. Tell me about it. I'm having the same problem. With your thermal regulation, something like that. Izuku chose his words carefully. I think my quirk might be more complex than I originally thought. There are layers to it. And right now, those layers aren't playing nicely together. Todoroki leaned forward, genuinely interested. What kind of layers? How much can I tell him? Izuku wondered. He couldn't mention one for all, but maybe he could talk about the other complications. My great-great-grandfather's techniques, he said finally, they're not just thermal regulation. There are other aspects. Enhanced perception, coordination, things I'm still figuring out, and they all work together as a system, but only if I can keep them balanced. And now the balance is disrupted. Exactly. Izuku flexed his fingers experimentally, feeling the faint warmth that meant his sunborn abilities were still there. It's like trying to play a piano when someone's retuned half the keys. The music is still there, but everything sounds wrong. Todoroki nodded slowly. I understand. When I first started using my fire side again, it felt like learning to walk with a new leg. My ice abilities had adapted to compensating for the missing element, so adding fire back in threw everything off. How did you fix it? Slowly. Carefully, and with a lot of help from people who understood what I was going through. Todoroki's smile was small but genuine. I thought you might benefit from the same approach. The conversation was interrupted by All Might's arrival, looking uncharacteristically subdued. He greeted Todoroki politely, but his attention was clearly focused on Izuku. How are you feeling, my boy? Better, Izuku said, and it was mostly true. The constant ache in his muscles had faded to a dull throb, and he could move without feeling like his bones were made of broken glass. Recovery girl thinks I can go home tomorrow. Excellent. All Might's smile was bright, but Izuku could see the worry behind it. And your condition? Still working on it, Izuku said carefully, glancing at Todoroki. I think the problem is trying to force integration instead of letting it happen naturally. All Might caught the meaningful look and nodded. These things do take time. Perhaps we should focus on mastering one element before attempting combinations. After Todoroki left, All Might pulled his chair closer to the bed. I want you to know, he said quietly, if you want to return one for all, I'll understand. I never intended for the transfer to cause you harm. No, Izuku said immediately. I'm not giving up. This is just a learning curve. I'll figure it out. You don't have to do this alone, you know. There are people who can help. I know. Izuku smiled, thinking of Todoroki's visit and his mom's constant worry and the get-well messages from his classmates that had been arriving all week. I'm starting to understand that. All Might squeezed his shoulder gently. Good, because being a hero isn't about carrying every burden by yourself. It's about knowing when to ask for help and when to offer it. That night, alone in his hospital room, Izuku stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of everything that had happened. Two quirks that refused to work together. A legacy he wasn't sure he was ready for. Friends who cared enough to visit him when he was broken. What do I do? He asked his ancestor silently. What you have always done, came the patient reply. Learn, adapt, grow stronger through adversity. But what if I can't? What if the powers are just incompatible? Then you will find another way. Power is not about force, young one. It is about harmony. Your breathing techniques work because they flow with your body's natural rhythms. This new power, you must learn its rhythm as well and then teach both rhythms to dance together. Izuku closed his eyes and tried to feel both powers within him. His sunborn abilities were warm and steady, like a banked fire waiting for fuel. One for all was electric potential, raw energy looking for direction. Maybe the problem wasn't that they were incompatible. Maybe the problem was that he was trying to use them the same way. Different tools for different purposes, he realized. like having a hammer and a screwdriver. They're both useful but not for the same job. Wisdom, his ancestor, approved. Now rest. Tomorrow you begin learning how to be a craftsman instead of just a wielder. As Izuku drifted off to sleep, he felt something shift in his chest. Not the violent clash of competing powers, but something more like recognition, like two different songs finding a common beat. It was going to be a long road to mastery. But for the first time since the cafe, he was starting to believe he could walk it. Outside his window, the first stars were appearing in the evening sky. And somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of heroes beginning their night patrol, keeping the city safe while he healed. Soon he would join them, not as the wielder of a single quirk, but as something new, something that had never existed before. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, but mostly it felt like coming home. 2 weeks after his discharge from the hospital, Izuku was finally starting to feel like himself again. Sort of. The integration issues between his sunborn quirk and One for All hadn't disappeared overnight, but he'd made progress. Instead of trying to force them to work together, he'd started thinking of them as separate tools for different situations. Sunborn for precision work, endurance, and thermal regulation. One for All for raw power when he absolutely needed it. The trick was not using them at the same time. Looking better, Midoriya, Ida commented as they walked through the evening streets of Hosu City. Your coordination seems much improved. Thanks. Recovery Girl's physical therapy regimen is brutal, but it works. They were supposed to be shadowing the hero manual for their internship week, but the Hosu City Patrol had been quiet so far. A few minor incidents, a purse snatcher here, a drunk and disorderly there, but nothing that required serious hero intervention. Manual had split them up to cover more ground, with strict instructions to call for backup if anything significant happened. Of course, that's when Izuku's enhanced hearing picked up the screaming. It was coming from the old warehouse district, maybe 6 blocks away. Multiple voices, high with terror, and underneath it all a sound that made his ancestors' memories stir uneasily. Hunting calls, the ancient voice murmured, something that should not be. Did you hear that? Izuku asked, already changing direction toward the sound. Ida nodded grimly. Civilian distress. We should contact Manual first. Another scream cut through the night air, closer this time. Then the distinctive sound of an explosion that definitely wasn't natural. No time, Izuku said, breaking into a run. People are in danger now. They sprinted through the narrow streets, Ida's engines providing bursts of speed, while Izuku used his breathing techniques to maintain pace without burning out. The screaming got louder as they approached, and Izuku began picking up other sounds. The clash of metal on metal, shouted orders, and something like animal growling. When they rounded the final corner, the scene that greeted them was like something out of a nightmare. The hero Killer Stain stood in the middle of an alley, his serrated blade dripping with blood. 3 heroes lay paralyzed around him, native, struggling weakly against whatever quirk had frozen his body. Ingenium, Ida's older brother, unconscious and bleeding from a head wound, and Manual, who looked like he'd been thrown through a brick wall. But that wasn't the worst part. Crouched in the shadows behind Stain was something that definitely wasn't human. It had the basic bipedal shape, but its proportions were wrong, too tall, too thin, with arms that hung nearly to the ground. Its skin had the same grayish pallor Izuku remembered from USJ, and when it turned its head toward them, its eyes reflected the streetlight like mirrors. Feral Demon, his ancestor's voice was tight with recognition. Lower intelligence than the hybrid we faced before, but more savage, more hungry. Ingenium, Ida's voice cracked with anguish as he spotted his brother's still form. Stain turned at the sound, and his scarred face split into a predatory grin. More fake heroes, he said, raising his blood-stained sword. How convenient. I was just explaining to your friend here about the corruption of modern hero society. The demon thing beside him made a sound like breaking glass mixed with static. Up close, Izuku could see that its mouth was full of jagged teeth, and there were symbols carved into its flesh that seemed to writhe when he looked directly at them. What is that thing? Ida demanded, his engines sparking with barely contained fury. My associate, Stain said casually. It has a particular taste for so-called heroes, finds their blood, enlightening. The creature's head snapped toward them with predatory interest, and Izuku felt his sunborn quirk react instinctively. Heat began building in his chest, responding to the same wrongness that had triggered his powers during that first encounter 10 months ago. This is different from the hybrid, his ancestor observed. Cruder fusion. The demon essence is dominant, using the human form as a shell, more dangerous in some ways, less controlled in others. "Ida," Izuku said quietly, settling into his breathing pattern, "we need to be careful. That thing isn't just a villain, it's something else entirely." But Ida wasn't listening. His engines were roaring to life, filling the alley with blue exhaust flames. "You hurt my brother," he snarled at Stain. "I'll kill you." "No." Izuku lunged forward, trying to intercept his friend's charge, but Ida was already moving with reciprocal burst acceleration. The attack was fast, precise, and completely predictable. Stain sidestepped at the last second, his blade flicking out to nick Ida's arm. The paralysis effect was immediate. Ida's engines cut out mid-flight, and he crashed into the alley wall in a shower of sparks. "Pathetic," Stain said, wiping his blade clean. "Blinded by revenge, fighting for personal satisfaction instead of justice. You're exactly the kind of fake hero this world needs to be purged of." The demon took that as its cue to attack. It moved like liquid shadow, flowing across the alley walls in defiance of gravity. Its claws left gouges in the brick as it scuttled toward Izuku with inhuman speed, jaws gaping wide enough to bite his head clean off. Now his ancestor commanded. Izuku's breathing shifted to the combat pattern he'd been practicing in secret, not the thermal regulation he used for daily activities, but something deeper, older. Heat flooded his system, but instead of just warming his muscles, it enhanced everything: reaction time, coordination, sensory processing. Time seemed to slow as the creature lunged at him. He could see the exact trajectory of its attack, the micro-adjustments it made mid-leap, even the pattern of saliva drops falling from its jaws. His body moved with perfect precision, stepping just far enough to the side to avoid the claws while positioning himself for a counterattack. His palm struck the demon's shoulder as it passed, and the effect was immediate. The creature shrieked as steam rose from the point of contact, its gray flesh beginning to blacken and crack. It rolled away from him, shaking its head frantically and making sounds like a broken radio. "Interesting," Stain said, studying Izuku with newfound attention. "You're not like the others, are you? There's something older about your fighting style." "I'm nothing like you," Izuku replied, keeping his breathing steady and his eyes on both enemies. "I don't kill people to prove a point." "No." "Then what do you do with that power of yours?" Stain gestured to the demon, which was circling them both now like a wounded animal. "I can smell the potential for violence on you, boy, the capacity for lethality. What's stopping you from using it?" It was a fair question, and one Izuku had been wrestling with ever since discovering his abilities. His ancestors' techniques were designed for fighting demons, creatures that couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't be reformed, could only be destroyed. But he was training to be a hero, not an executioner. "The demon is not human," his ancestor's voice was urgent. "It feels no pain, knows no mercy. Restraint will only get you killed." "But I'm not you," Izuku thought back. "I have to find another way." The creature chose that moment to attack again, this time targeting the paralyzed Ida. Izuku intercepted it with a burst of one for all-enhanced speed, tackling the demon mid-leap and sending them both tumbling across the alley floor. The brief contact let him study its physiology more closely. The gray skin was thick but not impenetrable. The muscle structure was enhanced but still followed basic human anatomy. Most importantly, the demon symbols carved into its flesh seemed to be the source of its unnatural abilities. Disrupt the markings, he realized. Break the connection. Instead of trying to destroy the creature outright, Izuku focused his heat generation on the symbols themselves. Each touch sent thermal energy directly into the carved lines, causing them to glow red-hot before cracking like overheated glass. The demon's movements became more erratic as its supernatural enhancements failed. It was still dangerous, stronger and faster than a normal human, but no longer the inhuman predator it had been moments before. "Clever," Stain acknowledged, raising his sword as the weakened creature stumbled between them. "But you're still holding back. Why?" "Because that's what heroes do," Izuku said simply. "We find solutions that don't require killing." Stain's laugh was genuinely amused. Even when faced with something that exists only to kill others, how wonderfully naive. The hero killer's attack came without warning, a lightning-fast thrust aimed directly at Izuku's heart. But the enhanced perception from his breathing technique let him track the blade's path with perfect clarity. He twisted aside, the sword passing close enough to cut his costume fabric, and grabbed Stain's wrist. "You want to see what my power really does?" Izuku asked, letting heat flow through his palm. "It doesn't kill, it heals." The thermal energy he channeled wasn't the burning heat he'd used on the demons, but something gentler. A warmth that loosened cramped muscles, eased joint stiffness, and accelerated natural healing processes. He could feel Stain's body responding despite the man's obvious surprise, old injuries beginning to mend, chronic pain fading. My great-great-grandfather used these techniques to save people in the mountains, Izuku continued, maintaining the healing contact even as Stain tried to pull away. Hypothermia victims, avalanche survivors, lost hikers. He could have killed with them, but he chose to save lives instead. Impossible, Stain breathed, staring at his sword arm. The chronic tremor that had plagued it for years was gone, the muscles responding with perfect coordination for the first time in decades. This power, it's not possible. Everything's possible if you use your abilities to help people instead of hurt them. The philosophical moment was interrupted by the demon's renewed attack. Weakened but not defeated, it had been circling them while they talked, and now it struck at both of them simultaneously with desperate fury. But Izuku was ready. Transparent world. The enhanced perception technique activated smoothly this time, without the violent overload he'd experienced during the quirk assessment. Every detail of the alley became crystal clear. The demon's muscle tension, Stain's breathing pattern, the exact positions of the paralyzed heroes, even the trajectory of dust motes in the air. He could see the demon's attack coming 3 seconds before it began. More importantly, he could see the solution. Izuku moved with perfect precision, intercepting the creature's charge while simultaneously grabbing Stain and yanking him out of the path of the claws. The three of them collided in a controlled tangle that left the demon pinned between them, unable to use its superior reach. "What are you doing?" Stain demanded, trying to bring his sword to bear. "Teamwork," Izuku replied, pressing his palm against another cluster of demon markings. "You want to purge corruption from hero society? Here's some actual corruption right here." Understanding dawned in Stain's scarred features. The demon wasn't just a villain, it was an abomination that threatened everything he claimed to stand for. His blade swept down, not to kill but to sever the creature's arm at the shoulder, removing its primary weapon. Working together, they systematically dismantled the demon's supernatural enhancements. Izuku disrupted the carved symbols with controlled heat, while Stain used his superior combat experience to predict and counter its attacks. It wasn't pretty or heroic, more like extremely dangerous surgery, but it was effective. Within minutes, the creature was reduced to its base human form, unconscious and breathing but no longer dangerous. "Fascinating," Stain murmured, studying the unconscious figure. "A human, modified with something that shouldn't exist. Where did such a thing come from?" "I don't know," Izuku admitted, deactivating his transparent world technique and feeling the familiar mild headache that came with overuse. "But this is the second one I've encountered. There might be more." Before Stain could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the alley. Multiple heroes moving fast, with Endeavor's distinctive flame signature leading the pack. "This conversation isn't over," Stain said, resheathing his sword. "You've given me much to think about, young hero. Perhaps there's hope for your generation after all." He melted into the shadows between buildings, disappearing with the practiced ease of someone who'd been evading capture for years. By the time Endeavor and his team reached the alley, only Izuku, the paralyzed heroes, and the unconscious demon remained. "Report," Endeavor commanded, his flames casting dancing shadows on the alley walls. Izuku looked around at the scene, 3 injured heroes, 1 defeated monster, and evidence of a battle that had ended without any deaths. "Villain attack," he said carefully. "The hero killer was here, but he fled when he heard you approaching. We managed to subdue his associate. It wasn't the complete truth, but it was accurate enough. The media would report it as another encounter with Stain, the unconscious figure would be classified as a quirk-enhanced criminal, and the public would never know how close they'd come to something much worse." Later, after the paramedics had treated the injured heroes and government agents had taken custody of the demon, Izuku found himself sitting on a hospital bench next to Todoroki. His classmate had arrived with Endeavor's team, sporting his own collection of cuts and bruises from a separate encounter. "You fought the hero killer," Todoroki said. "It wasn't a question." "Yeah, with Ida, is he? He'll recover. His engines took some damage, but nothing permanent." Todoroki was quiet for a moment, studying Izuku's face. "The news reports are calling it a successful villain apprehension. They're not mentioning the other thing." "What other thing?" Izuku asked carefully. "The creature that shouldn't have existed, the one that left claw marks in solid brick and had symbols carved into its flesh." Todoroki's mismatched eyes were serious. "I've seen the government clean up crews, Midoriya. That wasn't a normal villain." Izuku considered his options. He'd sworn to keep one for all secret, but this was different. If there were more demon-human hybrids out there, his classmates deserved to know what they might be facing. How much do you really want to know? He asked finally. Everything. If these things are targeting heroes, we need to understand what we're dealing with. So Izuku told him. Not about One for All, that secret wasn't his to share, but about the creatures, about his family history, about the techniques he'd inherited, and why they seemed to work against things that normal quirks couldn't touch. When he finished, Todoroki was quiet for a long time. Demons, he said eventually. You're talking about actual demons. I know how it sounds. No, it makes sense. Todoroki's expression was thoughtful rather than skeptical. There are quirks that let people fly, read minds, alter reality itself. Why not quirks that can create or summon supernatural entities? The question is, who's making them? And why are they targeting heroes? Before Todoroki could answer, Izuku's phone buzzed with a text from All Might. Well done tonight. We need to talk soon about expanding your training. There are things you'll need to know. As they walked out of the hospital into the pre-dawn light, Izuku felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. 2 quirks to master, secrets to keep, and now evidence that someone was creating demon-human hybrids for unknown purposes. But for the first time since gaining One for All, the burden didn't feel overwhelming. He'd proven tonight that he could use both abilities without them tearing him apart. He'd found a way to fight effectively without abandoning his principles. Most importantly, he discovered that he didn't have to face these challenges alone. You did well, his ancestor's voice was warm with approval. You found balance between power and mercy, strength and wisdom. That is the true path of a protector. What comes next? Izuku wondered. Greater challenges, harder choices, but also stronger allies and deeper understanding. As the sun rose over Hosu City, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange, Izuku felt ready for whatever those challenges might bring. The Age of Heroes was evolving, and he was evolving with it, one breath at a time. The HPSC building looked exactly like what it was, a government facility designed to intimidate civilians and reassure politicians. All clean lines, reflective glass, and security checkpoints that made airport screenings look casual. Izuku had never wanted to be anywhere less in his life. Relax, All Might murmured as they waited in the sterile lobby. This is routine follow-up from the Hosu incident. Just answer their questions honestly and let me handle the politics. Easy for him to say. The symbol of peace could walk into any government building in Japan and be treated like visiting royalty. Izuku was just a first-year student who'd somehow gotten mixed up in 2 separate encounters with creatures that officially didn't exist. Midoriya Izuku, a woman in a severe business suit, approached them with the kind of smile that belonged in a dentist's office. Agent Yamashiro, thank you for coming in. She led them through a maze of corridors that all looked identical, beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and doors marked with uninformative numbers. Finally, they arrived at a conference room where 2 other agents were already waiting. Please, have a seat, Agent Yamashiro said, gesturing to chairs arranged around a polished table. This won't take long. The debriefing started normally enough. Standard questions about the Hosu incident, timeline of events, villain capabilities, civilian casualties avoided. Izuku answered carefully, sticking to the facts while avoiding anything that might compromise Stain's unexpected cooperation. But then the questions got weird. Your great-great-grandfather, Agent Yamashiro said, consulting a tablet that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. Kamado Tanjiro, mountain rescue specialist, active from 1847 to 1923. That's right, Izuku said carefully. Where were they going with this? Interesting career longevity for someone in such a dangerous profession. She swiped through what looked like historical records, particularly given the unique nature of some of his rescue operations. All Might shifted in his chair, his expression sharpening. What kind of unique nature? Agent Yamashiro turned the tablet around, showing them a photograph that looked like it had been taken with equipment from the early 1900s. It showed a group of men in traditional mountain gear standing around what appeared to be a cave entrance. In the center was a figure Izuku recognized from his mom's photo album, Tanjiro, holding that same curved sword. But it wasn't the people that made Izuku's breath catch. It was what they were standing over. Bodies, lots of them. And while the photo quality was poor, there was something wrong about their proportions. Limbs that bent the wrong way, faces that had too many teeth, skin that looked gray even in black and white. Your ancestors' unit didn't just perform mountain rescues, Agent Yamashiro continued. They specialized in what the records call anomalous threat elimination. creatures that preyed on isolated communities, things that local authorities couldn't handle. They knew, Izuku realized. The government has known about demons for over a century. Why are you showing us this? All Might's voice was carefully neutral, but Izuku could hear the tension underneath. Because young Midoriya's recent encounters suggest that his family's specialized knowledge may be relevant to current threats. Agent Yamashiro closed the tablet and leaned forward. We've had 3 confirmed sightings of bioquirk anomalies in the past 6 months. USJ, Hosu, and 1 incident in Yokohama that was classified above your clearance levels. Bioquirk anomalies, Izuku repeated. Is that what you're calling them? It's cleaner than the alternatives. Another agent, who'd been silent until now, finally spoke. He was older, with gray hair and scars that suggested field experience. The public isn't ready for the truth about what's out there, but heroes like you might need to be. All Might's frown deepened. Are you suggesting that Midoriya is being targeted because of his family history? We're suggesting, Agent Yamashiro said smoothly, that his family history might be the reason he's capable of fighting these things effectively. Most heroes' quirks are useless against bioquirk anomalies. They adapt too quickly, regenerate too fast, but thermal disruption techniques like his seem to cause permanent damage. The room fell silent as everyone processed this information. Izuku's mind was racing, connecting dots he'd never seen before. His great-great-grandfather hadn't just been a mountain rescuer, he'd been part of some kind of secret government program to fight demons. And now, over a century later, the same threats were coming back. This is why I inherited the memories, he realized. Not just to carry on a legacy, but to fight a war that never really ended. What do you want from me? He asked quietly. Cooperation, the scarred agent said, information sharing, and possibly consultation on equipment development. He gestured to the wall, which suddenly lit up with a holographic display. Technical schematics filled the air, showing blade designs and what looked like some kind of focusing apparatus. We've been reverse engineering artifacts from your ancestors' era, he continued. Weapons specifically designed for fighting anomalous threats, but without someone who understands the underlying principles, they're just expensive metal. Izuku studied the schematics, his ancestors' memories stirring in response to the familiar designs. Nichiren's steel, the ancient voice whispered, forged to hold and channel solar energy. These people understand more than they're saying. You want me to test weapons, Izuku said. To help you figure out how they work. We want you to be prepared, Agent Yamashiro corrected, because based on our intelligence, the bioquirk anomaly incidents are escalating. And next time you might not get lucky. All Might stood up abruptly. That's enough. Midoriya is a student, not a government contractor. If you want his cooperation, you'll need to make formal arrangements through UA and his legal guardians. Of course, Agent Yamashiro said, though her smile suggested she'd expected this reaction. We'll be in touch with the appropriate parties. In the meantime, she slid a business card across the table. If you encounter any more anomalies, please contact us immediately. For everyone's safety. The ride back to UA was quiet until they were safely inside All Might's office with the door closed. Well, the symbol of peace said, slumping into his chair with a heavy sigh. That was illuminating. They've known all along, Izuku said, still trying to process everything they'd learned. About demons, about my family, probably about why my quirk works against them. It seems that way. The question is, what do we do with that information? Before Izuku could answer, there was a knock at the office door. Come in, All Might called. Hatsume may burst through the entrance like a pink-haired hurricane, dragging a cart loaded with equipment behind her. Perfect timing, she announced. I've been working on some new babies based on your thermal signature analysis, and I think I've cracked the energy efficiency problem. May, Izuku blinked. How did you know we were here? I've been monitoring the HPSC building for unusual electromagnetic signatures, she said matter-of-factly, as if stalking government facilities was perfectly normal behavior. When I detected your thermal output leaving the building, I figured you'd come back here to debrief. All Might rubbed his temples. Miss Hatsume, while I appreciate your initiative, surveilling government buildings is probably illegal. Only if you get caught. May pulled a tarp off her cart, revealing an array of equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. Besides, after what happened at USJ and Hosu, it's obvious Midoriya needs better support gear. The standard hero costume fabrics can't handle prolonged thermal generation, and his current gloves are basically useless for precision work. She wasn't wrong. Izuku's hero costume had been patched multiple times after various training incidents, and he'd gone through 3 pairs of gloves in the past month alone. "What did you have in mind?" he asked, despite All Might's disapproving look. May's grin could have powered the building. "I'm so glad you asked." She grabbed the first item from her cart, a pair of gauntlets that seemed to be made of some kind of dark metal with intricate patterns etched into the surface. Thermal Focusing Gauntlets Mark 7. The metal channels your heat generation into specific patterns, allowing for more precise application while reducing overall energy expenditure. Izuku took the gauntlets, surprised by how light they were despite their solid appearance. The moment he put them on, he could feel the difference. His usual thermal generation felt more focused somehow, like having a magnifying glass for his quirk. "The metal," All Might said, studying the patterns on the gauntlets. "Where did you source it? That's the interesting part." May pulled out a tablet covered in technical specifications. "I started with standard titanium alloy, but when I analyzed the energy signatures from Midoriya's training sessions, I realized I needed something that could actually store and channel thermal energy instead of just conducting it." She pointed to a series of charts that meant nothing to Izuku but seemed to fascinate All Might. "I ended up creating a composite material that includes trace amounts of meteorite iron, specifically samples from the Jaibon meteorite that fell in Namibia around 1838. Something about the cosmic radiation exposure gives it unique thermodynamic properties." "Meteoric iron," Izuku's ancestor whispered. "The old smiths knew of such things. Metal that has touched the heavens holds the sun's power more readily." "That's remarkably insightful," All Might said slowly. "How did you know to try meteoric materials?" "Lucky guess," May shrugged. "Plus some very expensive trial and error. But wait, there's more." The next item was even more impressive, a sword that looked like something from a museum, except for the subtle technological enhancements built into the hilt and guard. "Nikarin Blade Modern Edition," May announced proudly. "Based on historical designs but updated with current metallurgy and energy channeling principles. The blade itself is forged from the same meteoric composite as the gauntlets, with microscopic channels throughout the metal that allow for thermal energy distribution along the entire cutting edge." Izuku accepted the weapon with reverent care. The moment his fingers closed around the grip, he felt a resonance in his chest that had nothing to do with his quirks. This was something deeper, a connection to techniques and traditions that went back generations. Yes, his ancestor's voice was thick with emotion. "This is how it should be, form and function in perfect harmony." "How did you know about Nikarin blades?" All Might asked. "Those are extremely specialized historical artifacts." "Research," May said cheerfully. "After studying Midoriya's thermal generation patterns, I realized they were consistent with pre-Quirk era techniques for solar energy manipulation. So I dug into historical records about traditional metalworking, found references to weapons designed for cutting sunlight, and reverse-engineered the principles using modern materials science." She paused, her expression becoming more serious. "Plus, I may have hacked into some government databases that had very interesting files about specialized threat elimination equipment, purely for academic purposes, of course." All Might and Izuku exchanged a look. "Miss Hatsume," All Might said carefully, "exactly how much do you know about the threats Midoriya has been facing?" "Enough to know they're not normal villains," May replied. "The energy signatures don't match any documented quirk patterns, and the physical evidence suggests enhanced durability that shouldn't be possible with human physiology. Honestly, if I didn't know better, I'd say you've been fighting some kind of supernatural entities." The silence that followed was telling. "Oh," May said, her eyes widening. "Oh wow, you actually have been fighting supernatural entities. That's why you need the specialized equipment, that's why the thermal disruption works. That's why," she grabbed Izuku's shoulders. "This is amazing. Do you know how much this could advance our understanding of paradimensional physics? The applications for reality anchor technology alone," Miss Hatsume, All Might interrupted gently. "This information cannot leave this room, for the safety of everyone involved." "Of course. Professional discretion, absolutely," May nodded rapidly. "But I'm definitely the right person to be designing your support equipment. I mean, who else is going to understand the thermodynamic principles needed to weaponize solar energy against supernatural threats?" She had a point, Izuku realized. May might be eccentric and borderline obsessive, but her technical skills were unmatched. And she'd already proven that she could create equipment specifically tailored to his unique needs. "There's one more thing," he said, looking between All Might and May. "I've been having trouble with power integration, multiple systems that don't always work well together. Is there any way to create equipment that could help with that?" Mei's eyes lit up again. Multi-system coordination, that's a fascinating challenge, let me think. She pulled out what looked like a smartphone crossed with a tricorder. If you have competing energy signatures that need to be balanced, what you need is some kind of regulatory interface. Something that can monitor your internal systems and provide real-time feedback. 20 minutes later, she'd sketched out plans for what she called a biological harmony monitor, a chest-mounted device that would track his heart rate, breathing patterns, core temperature, and electromagnetic output, then provide subtle vibration cues to help him maintain optimal balance between his different abilities. It's not a crutch, she explained as she added details to the schematic, more like training wheels. Once your muscle memory adapts to the optimal patterns, you won't need the external feedback. How long would something like that take to build? All Might asked. For a prototype, maybe a week. For a fully tested, field-ready version, 2 weeks tops, Mei grinned. This is exactly the kind of challenge I live for. They spent the rest of the afternoon testing the preliminary equipment. The gauntlets worked even better than Mei had promised, allowing Izuku to generate focused heat with about half his normal energy expenditure. The sword felt like an extension of his own body, perfectly balanced and responsive to his thermal manipulation techniques. Most importantly, using the equipment together felt natural in a way his quirks still didn't. Like the tools had been designed specifically to bridge the gap between his different abilities. This changes everything, he said, running through a basic sword form while the gauntlets channeled heat energy down the blade's length. With proper equipment, I might actually be able to use both quirks safely. That's the idea, Mei said, making notes on her tablet. Though you'll need to be careful not to become dependent on the equipment, tools should enhance your natural abilities, not replace them. Wisdom, his ancestor approved. A warrior must be ready to fight with hands and breath alone, even when blades and armor are lost. As the sun set outside All Might's office windows, Izuku found himself feeling more optimistic than he had in weeks. He still didn't fully understand the threat they were facing, or his role in whatever conflict was coming. But for the first time since gaining One for All, he felt properly equipped to handle both his powers and his responsibilities. There's one more thing we need to discuss, All Might said as Mei packed up her equipment. Training. If you're going to be using weapons in addition to your quirks, you'll need instruction from someone with actual combat experience. I know some people, Izuku said quietly. His ancestors' memories included forms and techniques, but muscle memory and theoretical knowledge were different things. My mom mentioned that there might be other families who kept the old traditions alive. Good. Between proper training, Miss Hatsume's equipment, and whatever support the HPSC might provide, you should be well prepared for whatever comes next. As they walked out of UA together, Mei chattering excitedly about additional equipment upgrades, while All Might listened with patient amusement, Izuku felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. But this time it didn't feel overwhelming. He had tools now, allies who understood what he was facing. And most importantly, he had a clearer sense of his own capabilities and limitations. Ready for the greater test? His ancestor asked. As ready as I can be, Izuku replied. The city lights were beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness, and somewhere out there, heroes were starting their evening patrols. Soon he would join their ranks, not just as a student in training, but as someone equipped to face threats that most heroes couldn't even imagine. The age of heroes was evolving again, and this time he was ready to be part of that evolution, one properly equipped breath at a time. The warehouse smelled like antiseptic and something else, something organic that made Izuku's ancestor stir uneasily in the back of his mind. Remember, Aizawa's voice crackled through their comm units, this is a reconnaissance mission. Observe, document, and retreat. Do not engage unless civilians are in immediate danger. Easy for him to say. He wasn't the one crouched behind a shipping container, watching figures in lab coats move between what looked suspiciously like operating tables. Through the gaps in the warehouse's corrugated walls, Izuku could see enough to make his stomach churn. This is wrong, his ancestor whispered urgently. The scent, it is the smell of corruption given form. Class 1A had been split into 3 teams for this mission, their first real field operation since the internships. Intelligence suggested the League of Villains was using this abandoned medical facility for something the HPSC classified as high-priority threat research. What that meant in practice, apparently, was human experimentation on a scale that made Izuku's skin crawl. Visual confirmation on at least 12 subjects, Todoroki's voice came through the comm, clinical and controlled. Some appear to be modified, that was putting it mildly. From his position, Izuku could see the operating tables clearly enough to make out details he wished he couldn't. The figures strapped down weren't entirely human anymore: grayish skin, elongated limbs, faces that had been surgically altered to accommodate too many teeth. But these weren't the crude fusion attempts he'd encountered before. These looked refined, purposeful, like someone had spent months perfecting the process. Team 2, report, Aizawa commanded. Multiple League members on the upper level. Ida's voice was tight with controlled tension. Including what appears to be a command structure. They're monitoring the procedures from an observation deck. Team 3, Uraraka's response was barely a whisper. Containment cells, lots of them, some are occupied. The comm channel fell silent as everyone processed that information. Containment cells meant prisoners. Prisoners meant people who'd been taken for the experiments. People who were probably still alive, still aware of what was being done to them. We have to do something, Izuku thought desperately. Yes, his ancestor agreed grimly, but carefully. This place reeks of preparation. They are expecting heroes to come. Before he could voice that concern, the decision was made for them. Bakugo's explosion lit up the night sky like a miniature sun. So much for stealth, Kirishima's voice came through the comm, followed by the distinctive sound of hardened skin meeting laboratory equipment. They spotted Team 2. We're going loud, damn it, Koch-chan, Izuku thought, but he was already moving. The mission parameters had just changed from reconnaissance to rescue, and every second they delayed meant more people suffering in those operating rooms. He vaulted over the shipping container, his breathing pattern shifting automatically to the combat configuration. Heat built in his chest as he sprinted toward the nearest entrance, Mei's gauntlets beginning to glow with channeled thermal energy. The first hybrid he encountered was waiting just inside the door. It had been human once, a woman based on the bone structure, but the modifications were extensive. 4 arms instead of 2, each ending in claws that looked surgically implanted. Skin that had been replaced with something that resembled gray scales. And eyes that reflected the warehouse's fluorescent lighting like mirrors. Upper-tier fusion, his ancestor observed with professional detachment. Demon essence integrated at the cellular level rather than simply grafted on. More stable, more dangerous. The creature moved with inhuman speed, all 4 arms striking simultaneously in a pattern designed to overwhelm any possible defense. But Izuku's enhanced perception let him track each attack individually, and his thermal manipulation gave him options the hybrid hadn't expected. Instead of dodging, he stepped into the creature's guard and pressed both palms against its torso. Superheated air erupted from his gauntlets, not just warming the skin but flash-heating the modified tissue underneath. The demon-fused cells couldn't handle the thermal shock. They began to separate and break down at the molecular level. The hybrid staggered backward, clutching at its chest where steam was rising from rapidly necrotizing flesh. But it didn't fall. Instead, it began to regenerate, new tissue growing to replace what Izuku had damaged. Of course it regenerates, he thought grimly. That would be too easy. Midoriya, Todoroki's voice from somewhere behind him. Duck! Izuku dropped to the floor just as a wave of freezing air swept over his head. The ice didn't just create barriers. It formed complex geometric patterns that channeled and focused the cold, creating zones of absolute zero that even enhanced regeneration couldn't overcome. The hybrid's healing stopped as its cellular functions ground to a halt in the sub-zero temperature. Not dead, but effectively neutralized. Impressive technique, Izuku said, picking himself up and dusting off his costume. I've been practicing precision applications, Todoroki replied, ice crystals still dancing around his left hand. Inspired by your thermal regulation methods. They moved deeper into the warehouse together, following the sounds of combat from the other teams. The layout was more complex than it had appeared from outside. Multiple levels connected by catwalks and service corridors, with the main laboratory occupying the center space like the hub of a wheel. Visual on the command deck, Todoroki reported into his comm. I count 4 League members plus what looks like a supervisor. Izuku followed his gaze to the observation platform overlooking the main lab. Shigaraki was there, his distinctive hand-covered appearance unmistakable even from a distance. Toga, her blonde hair catching the laboratory lights. Dabi, wreathed in blue flames that cast dancing shadows on the walls. And standing behind them, a figure that made every instinct Izuku had inherited scream warnings. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, with proportions that were almost human but not quite. Its skin had the same grayish pallor as the other hybrids, but the surgical modifications were so extensive that it was impossible to tell what it had originally been. Multiple arms, each ending in different types of claws. Eyes that were wrong, too many of them, positioned at angles that shouldn't have been possible. And covering its entire body, carved symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when observed directly. Upper Moon, his ancestor's voice was tight with recognition and fear, the highest tier of demon fusion. This one has maintained its intelligence while gaining power beyond measure. That's not possible, Izuku whispered. The government files said full integration wasn't sustainable. The government files are incomplete, came the grim response. There are things from the old times that they never properly documented. The conversation was interrupted by another explosion from Team 2's position, followed by Bakugo's distinctive battle cry. Whatever stealth they'd had was completely blown now, and the League was clearly prepared for hero intervention. All teams regroup at the central laboratory, Aizawa's voice crackled through the comm. We need to extract the prisoners and get out before the lights went out. Emergency power kicked in a second later, bathing everything in red light that made the shadows dance like living things. But in that moment of darkness, something had changed. The Upper Moon hybrid was no longer on the observation deck. Where did it go? Todoroki demanded, ice beginning to form around his hands. Izuku was already shifting to his enhanced perception mode, trying to track movement through the warehouse's complex layout. His breathing deepened, heat spreading through his system as his senses expanded beyond normal human limits. He could hear heartbeats from multiple directions, smell the chemical residue from the experiments, feel the electromagnetic signatures of his classmates' quirks scattered throughout the building. But there was something else, a void in his perception where something large should have been, like a hole in the air that his enhanced senses couldn't penetrate. It knows how to hide from traditional demon-slaying techniques, his ancestor realized. This is not just fusion, this is evolution. The attack came from directly above. The hybrid dropped from the ceiling like a spider, all 6 arms spread wide and claws extended to shred everything in reach. Its descent was silent, perfectly calculated to avoid Izuku's enhanced hearing until it was too late to dodge. But Todoroki was faster. A wall of ice erupted between them and the creature, thick enough to stop most attacks cold. The hybrid's claws struck the barrier with enough force to send cracks spiderwebbing across the surface, but the ice held. For about 3 seconds. Then the creature began to glow, heat radiating from its modified skin in waves that turned the ice wall into steam. Not the focused thermal generation that Izuku used, but something cruder and more violent, like a furnace given predatory intelligence. It adapted, Izuku realized with growing horror. It saw my techniques and learned to counter them. The melted ice wall collapsed in a flood of superheated water that forced both boys to retreat. The hybrid emerged from the steam like a nightmare made flesh, its too many eyes fixed on Izuku with unmistakable recognition. You, it spoke, and its voice was wrong, multiple tones overlapping, like several people speaking in unison. The Sun Bearer, we have been curious about you. Charming, Izuku managed, settling into his combat stance and feeling his gauntlets begin to channel thermal energy. Sorry to disappoint, but I'm not really in a mood for conversation. The hybrid's laugh was like breaking glass. Conversation? No, but experimentation. It flexed all 6 arms simultaneously, claws gleaming in the emergency lighting. That could be educational. What followed wasn't really a fight so much as a masterclass in why Upper Moon demons had been feared even in his ancestors' time. The creature moved with impossible speed and perfect coordination, each arm attacking independently while its regeneration healed any damage Izuku managed to inflict. It adapted to every technique he tried. When he used focused heat, it developed thermal resistance. When he relied on enhanced reflexes, it began predicting his movements. Worse, it was learning from the encounter. Each exchange taught it more about his capabilities, more about the weaknesses in his fighting style. Todoroki, Izuku called as he barely avoided a claw strike that would have taken his head off. Pattern 7. It was a coordination technique they'd developed during joint training. Todoroki would create specific ice formations, while Izuku provided thermal regulation to prevent friendly fire. They'd never tested it in actual combat, but desperate times called for experimental tactics. Todoroki responded immediately, ice erupting from the floor in complex geometric patterns that channeled and focused the cold into specific zones. But instead of trying to freeze the hybrid directly, he created a maze of thermal barriers that forced the creature to move through predictable paths. Izuku used those moments of constrained movement to apply his most advanced technique. Transparent world. The enhanced perception activated smoothly this time, the months of practice finally paying off. Every detail of the warehouse became crystal clear. The hybrid's muscle tension, the flow of demon-enhanced blood through its modified circulatory system, even the microscopic fractures in its regenerating tissue from previous damage. More importantly, he could see the symbols carved into its flesh. Not just decorative scarring, but functional components of whatever process had created it. Each marking was connected to others in a complex network that channeled and controlled the demon essence throughout its body. Disrupt the network, his ancestor urged. Break the connections and the fusion will become unstable. But the hybrid was too fast, too aware of what he was trying to do. Every time Izuku moved to target a specific symbol, the creature shifted to protect that area. Its intelligence was working against him, predicting his tactics and countering them. That's when Class 1A's training really paid off. Midoriya, Uraraka's voice from the catwalk above. Catch! She dropped toward the hybrid with her gravity manipulation engaged, moving in a perfect arc that put her behind the creature's guard. Not to attack, she wasn't equipped for that kind of combat, but to provide distraction at the exact moment Izuku needed it. The hybrid spun to track her movement, and for a split second, its attention was divided. Izuku struck with everything he had. Not just thermal energy this time, but one for all channeled through his gauntlets and focused through the Nichiren blade Mei had crafted. The combination of powers that had nearly torn him apart months ago now worked in perfect harmony, each system enhancing the others instead of competing. The superheated blade sliced through the hybrid's primary control symbol with surgical precision. The demon-enhanced flesh parted like paper, and the carefully maintained network of carved markings began to collapse. The creature's regeneration faltered, then failed entirely. Its multiple arms began to convulse as competing energies tore through its modified nervous system. For a moment, it looked almost human again, confused, frightened, trying to understand what was happening to its carefully engineered body. Then it began to scream. The sound was unlike anything Izuku had ever heard, not just pain, but the dissolution of identity itself as the fusion process reversed. The gray skin began to crack and peel away, revealing glimpses of what might have been a normal human underneath. But the process was unstable, uncontrolled. Instead of a clean separation, the competing essences were tearing the hybrid apart at the cellular level. "It's going to explode," Todoroki said quietly, ice already forming around his hands in preparation for defensive barriers. He was right. The hybrid's body was beginning to glow as conflicting energies sought release. When it went off, it would take half the warehouse with it, along with any prisoners still trapped in the containment cells. No choice, Izuku realized. I have to contain the blast. He stepped forward, placing both hands on the hybrid's convulsing form and opening himself completely to his thermal regulation abilities. Not to attack this time, but to absorb. To draw the chaotic energies into his own system and dissipate them safely. The backlash hit him like being struck by lightning while standing in a furnace. Every nerve in his body fired simultaneously as foreign energies flooded his system. His transparent world perception exploded into sensory overload. He could see everything, hear everything, feel everything in the warehouse and beyond. For a terrifying moment, he thought he was going to lose himself entirely in the cascade of information. But then his training kicked in, the breathing techniques his ancestor had taught him providing an anchor in the chaos. Control, he told himself desperately. Channel it, don't fight it, guide it. Slowly, painfully, he began to redirect the hybrid's dying energies through his own system and out into the air as harmless heat. The process felt like trying to swallow the sun, but it worked. The explosive buildup dissipated, the hybrid's body finally went still, and the immediate threat was neutralized. The cost was immediate and severe. Izuku collapsed as his nervous system finally gave out, blood streaming from his nose and ears. His vision was a kaleidoscope of overlapping images. Normal sight mixed with thermal signatures, mixed with electromagnetic patterns, mixed with sensory input from the enhanced perception that refused to turn off. Midoriya, multiple voices, concerned and frightened. Hands reaching for him, voices calling his name, the distant sound of Aizawa barking orders into his comm unit. But underlying it all was something that made his blood run cold. Slow, deliberate applause from the observation deck. Through his fractured vision, Izuku could see Shigaraki standing at the railing, his scarred hands coming together in mocking appreciation. "Impressive," the villain called down. "Very impressive, but you missed something important." The hybrid's body twitched, not the whole thing, most of it was definitely dead, but something was moving underneath the gray skin like parasites fleeing a corpse. Dark shapes that flowed like liquid shadow, searching for new hosts. Demon Essence, his ancestor's voice was weak but urgent. The fusion failed, but the core survived. It seeks new flesh to inhabit, and there were plenty of targets. Class 1A was clustered around Izuku's fallen form, focused on helping their injured classmate instead of watching for secondary threats. The shadows moved with predatory purpose, flowing across the warehouse floor toward the nearest group of students. Toward Uraraka, who was trying to check Izuku's pulse. Toward Ida, who was coordinating evacuation routes. Toward Todoroki, whose ice powers were still focused on defensive barriers. Izuku tried to warn them, but his voice wouldn't work. The sensory overload had damaged something in his nervous system, leaving him paralyzed and mute while his friends walked into danger. Move, he commanded his body desperately. Just move, but it was too late. The shadow essence reached Uraraka first, flowing up her leg like living smoke. Her eyes widened in surprise, then began to change color as something else looked out through them. Much better, she said, but it wasn't her voice anymore. It was the hybrid's multi-toned speech, coming from a human throat. This host will serve adequately. The possessed Uraraka turned toward the rest of Class 1A with predatory interest, her gravity manipulation activating in ways that defied physics. Students began floating helplessly as she demonstrated powers no human should have been able to access. Fascinating, Shigaraki commented from above. The essence adapted faster than we predicted. This could be very useful. Izuku watched in horror as his best friend was turned into a weapon against their classmates. His enhanced perception showed him every detail, the way the demon essence was rewriting her nervous system, the specific points where it had attached to her brain, even the techniques he could use to disrupt the possession. But he couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything except lie there and watch as everything went wrong. This is my fault, he realized. I destroyed the hybrid, but I didn't think about what would happen to the essence afterward. Learn from it, his ancestor said grimly, but survive first. Your friends need you to recover. Around him, the warehouse erupted into chaos as Class 1A tried to subdue their possessed classmate without seriously hurting her. But they were holding back, trying to save someone who might already be lost. And in the observation deck above, Shigaraki was giving orders to evacuate with their successful test subject. They were going to take Uraraka. Take her and disappear into the night with whatever remained of her consciousness trapped inside a demon-possessed body. No, Izuku thought with desperate fury, I won't let that happen. He focused every remaining scrap of willpower on his breathing techniques, trying to force his paralyzed body back into action. The process felt like trying to restart a car with a flooded engine, but gradually, sensation began to return to his extremities. His fingers twitched, his breathing deepened. Heat began to build in his chest as his quirk responded to pure determination. Come on, he told himself. She saved you during the entrance exam. She stayed with you after the quirk assessment. She's your friend. Move. His eyes snapped open just as the possessed Uraraka prepared to launch the floating students into the warehouse's steel support beams. The Age of Heroes was about to face its greatest test. And this time, Izuku might not be strong enough to save everyone, but he was damn well going to try. For her, he thought, struggling to his feet as thermal energy flooded his system. For all of them. The final battle was about to begin. Izuku's legs felt like they were made of overcooked noodles, but somehow he stayed upright. Around him, the warehouse had descended into controlled chaos as Class 1A tried to subdue their possessed classmate without causing permanent harm. Uraraka, I know you're in there, Ida called out, dodging another gravity-enhanced attack that sent a steel beam sailing past his head. Fight it! The thing wearing Uraraka's face laughed with that horrible multi-toned voice. She can hear you, it taunted, making her body move in ways that defied human joint limitations. She's watching everything, helpless to stop it. Delicious despair. Focus, Izuku told himself, forcing his breathing into the combat pattern despite the lingering neural damage from containing the hybrid's death throes. Analyze the situation, find the weakness. His enhanced perception was still partly active, showing him the demon essence like a dark web wrapped around Uraraka's nervous system. The possession wasn't complete yet. Parts of her brain were still fighting the invasion, creating interference patterns in the entity's control. But those interference points were fading as the essence integrated more deeply with her biology. Todoroki, Izuku called, his voice hoarse but functional. Ice restraints, but don't freeze her core temperature. The cold might force the essence deeper. Understood. Todoroki's response was immediate, ice erupting from the floor in complex patterns designed to limit movement without causing hypothermia. The possessed Uraraka simply activated her quirk and floated above the ice barriers, her movements becoming more fluid as the demon essence learned to use her abilities. "Clever boy," it said through her mouth, "but you're too late. This body accepts us willingly now." "No," Izuku said firmly, settling into a combat stance despite his body's protests. "She's stronger than that." He was bluffing partly. But he'd seen Uraraka face down the zero-pointer during the entrance exam, watched her push through pain and exhaustion during training, observed her quiet determination to become a hero worthy of her family's sacrifice. If anyone could resist demonic possession through pure stubbornness, it was her. "Prove it," the entity challenged, and suddenly Uraraka was moving with inhuman speed, gravity manipulation warping space around her in ways that violated several laws of physics. The attack was perfectly coordinated, multiple gravity wells designed to crush Izuku from all directions simultaneously. No human could have calculated those angles, predicted those force vectors. The demon essence was using Uraraka's quirk with mathematical precision that her human brain never could have achieved. But Izuku wasn't just human anymore. His breathing shifted to the deepest combat pattern he knew, the one his ancestor had used against the strongest demons in the mountains. Heat flooded his system, but this time he didn't fight the chaotic mix of Sunborn and one for all energies. Instead, he let them find their own rhythm, their own balance. Synchronization, he realized as the two power systems began to harmonize instead of compete, not forcing them together, but letting them choose how to work as one. Time seemed to slow as thermal energy and inherited strength flowed through his body in perfect unison. He could see the gravity wells forming, track their interaction patterns, even predict where Uraraka would move next based on the micro-expressions the demon essence couldn't fully control. He stepped through the crushing forces like they were morning mist, each movement perfectly timed to exploit the gaps in the gravitational matrix. His right hand found Uraraka's wrist with surgical precision, and he pressed his palm against the pulse point where the demon essence was thickest. "Hello, Uraraka," he said quietly, letting gentle heat flow through the contact. Not the burning intensity he used against full demons, but something warmer, more human. "I know you're fighting. Let me help." For a moment, her brown eyes flickered with recognition. "Deku," the word came out in her real voice, confused and frightened. Then the demon essence reasserted control, snarling through her throat as it tried to break his grip. "Interference, this vessel is claimed." "Maybe," Izuku said, his breathing steady and controlled despite the entity's attempts to disrupt his hold. "But you made one mistake." "What mistake?" the possession hissed. "You picked someone with friends." The coordinated attack came from all directions at once. Todoroki created ice mirrors positioned throughout the warehouse, reflecting and focusing the emergency lighting into concentrated beams. Ida used his engines to generate precise vibrations that disrupted the demon essence's electromagnetic signature. Bakugo, surprisingly, contributed controlled explosions that created pressure waves tuned to interfere with supernatural entities. And Kirishima, bless him, simply grabbed onto Uraraka's other arm and held on with hardened skin, providing an anchor that the demon essence couldn't easily break. "What is this?" the entity demanded as its control began to waver under the coordinated interference. "Teamwork," Izuku said simply, and poured everything he had into the thermal contact. Not to hurt the demon essence, but to strengthen Uraraka. To remind her nervous system what normal human temperatures felt like, to give her consciousness a warm anchor in the chaos of possession. His heat became a lifeline she could follow back to herself. I can fight it," she gasped, her voice becoming more human with each word. "It's trying to rewrite my thoughts, but I remember. I remember why I'm here." "Good girl," Izuku murmured, maintaining the healing warmth even as his energy reserves depleted rapidly. "Hold on to that. Hold on to who you are." The demon essence made one last desperate attempt to maintain control, flooding Uraraka's system with alien impulses and predatory instincts. For a terrifying moment, Izuku felt her slipping away again as the entity tried to overwhelm her consciousness entirely. That's when the sun came up. The first rays of dawn light streamed through the warehouse's high windows, illuminating the improvised battlefield in shades of gold and orange. And something about that natural illumination made the demon essence recoil like it had been burned. "Solar energy," Izuku's ancestor whispered with fierce satisfaction. "The old enemy of all creatures of shadow." The entity's hold on Uraraka began to unravel as genuine sunlight touched her skin. Not just weakening, actively dissolving, like shadow fleeing from flame. Within seconds, the dark tendrils wrapped around her nervous system were burning away, leaving only confused human consciousness behind. Deku, Uraraka's eyes were her own again, wide and frightened but definitely human. What happened? I remember. Darkness and voices that weren't mine. You're okay, Izuku assured her, helping her stay upright as the possession's aftereffects made her legs unsteady. It's over, but it wasn't really. From the observation deck above, Shigaraki's voice cut through the dawn air like a blade. Interesting development, but hardly unexpected. He gestured to something behind him, and Izuku's enhanced hearing picked up the sound of heavy footsteps. Lots of them. A dozen more hybrids emerged from the warehouse's upper levels, moving with coordinated precision that spoke of intelligence and planning. These weren't the crude fusion attempts from earlier. They were refined, perfected, designed specifically for combat against heroes. And leading them was something that made Izuku's blood run cold. It had been the original Upper Moon hybrid, the one he'd thought he'd destroyed. But instead of dying, it had somehow reconstituted itself using the essence from its fallen form. Now it stood nearly 8 feet tall, its multiple arms equipped with surgical precision claws, its too many eyes fixed on Izuku with unmistakable hunger. You cost us a significant investment, it said in that horrible multi-toned voice. But you also provided valuable data about solar-based countermeasures. We've made adjustments. The hybrid's skin began to shift, revealing metallic implants that covered the carved symbols like armor plating. Protection against thermal disruption, Izuku realized with growing dread. They'd learned from their previous encounters and adapted. 12 enhanced units plus the Upper Moon variant, Aizawa's voice crackled through the comm, tight with professional assessment. Class 1A fall back to defensive positions. This is beyond your current capabilities. Maybe individually, Izuku thought, studying the enemy formation with his enhanced perception, but together. The sunrise was growing stronger, painting the warehouse in brilliant gold that made the hybrid's shadows dance unnaturally. And where the light touched them directly, he could see subtle signs of discomfort, slight flinching, minor coordination disruptions, the kind of weakness that a coordinated team could exploit. Everyone listen, he said into his comm, his breathing settling into the deepest combat pattern he knew. I need you to trust me. We can win this, but only if we work together perfectly. Midoriya, Todoroki's voice held a note of concern. Your energy reserves are already depleted from containing the first hybrid's death throes. You can't? Yes, I can. Izuku felt the familiar heat building in his chest, but this time it was different, controlled, harmonized. His sunborn abilities and One for All were no longer fighting for dominance. They were dancing together, each power enhancing the other in ways he'd never imagined possible. Todoroki, I need ice mirrors positioned to redirect morning sunlight toward the enemy formation. Bakugo, controlled explosions to create reflective dust clouds. Ida, use your engines to generate vibrations that disrupt their coordination. Everyone else, be ready to exploit the openings we create. That's insane, Bakugo said, but there was admiration in his voice. I love it. The coordinated assault began with Todoroki's ice constructs. Not barriers this time, but carefully angled mirrors that caught the streaming sunlight and focused it into concentrated beams. The hybrids flinched away from the reflected solar energy, their protective implants sparking as they tried to counter light-based attacks. Bakugo's explosions came next, filling the air with metallic particles that turned the entire warehouse into a kaleidoscope of reflected illumination. Every surface became a potential mirror, every dust mode a tiny lens that scattered and focused the morning light. The hybrids' formation began to break down as they struggled with the chaotic light patterns. Their enhanced coordination was disrupted by Ida's precisely calibrated vibrations, turning their greatest strength into a liability. And in the center of it all, Izuku began to move. Perfect synchronization, his ancestor observed with something like awe. Both powers flowing as one stream, neither dominating nor submitting. He could feel it, the exact balance point where sunborn thermal regulation and One for All enhancement created something entirely new. His breathing technique provided the rhythm, the foundation that let both powers work in harmony instead of competition. Heat and strength flowed through his body in perfect waves, each breath bringing deeper integration, each heartbeat strengthening the connection between inherited abilities and chosen legacy. This was what All Might had hoped for when he passed on One for All. This was what his great-great-grandfather had prepared him for through generations of technique and training. This was what it meant to be both sun-bearer and successor. Sunflare smash, he whispered, and the words felt like a prayer. The combination technique built slowly, thermal energy, and one for all power spiraling together in his right arm like miniature galaxies finding their orbital balance. The air around his hand began to glow, not with the harsh light of artificial illumination, but with something deeper, the warm radiance of dawn made tangible. The upper moon hybrid sensed the building power and moved to intercept, all 6 arms striking simultaneously in a pattern designed to overwhelm any human defense. But Izuku was beyond human limitations now, moving with perfect coordination between multiple power systems and enhanced by the tactical support of his entire class. He stepped through the hybrid's attack like it was happening in slow motion, each claw strike missing by precisely calculated margins. His breathing never wavered, his focus never shifted from the growing energy in his right hand. Now his ancestor whispered. Now his own voice agreed. The sunflare smash struck the hybrid center mass with the combined force of 2 legacies and the brilliant radiance of dawn itself. The impact sent shockwaves through the warehouse's steel framework, but the real damage was deeper. The technique didn't just destroy the creature's physical form, it unraveled the very fusion process that had created it. Light erupted from the point of contact, not the harsh glare of explosions, but something warm and clean, and utterly inimical to creatures of shadow. The hybrid screams filled the air as its carefully constructed modifications came apart at the molecular level, demon essence and human biology separating in ways that left neither intact. The other hybrids caught in the technique's area effect suffered similar fates, not destroyed so much as purified. Their unnatural enhancements burned away by concentrated solar energy until only confused human consciousness remained. When the light faded, 12 unconscious figures lay scattered across the warehouse floor. Human figures, breathing and alive but no longer dangerous, and Izuku collapsed like a marionette with cut strings. The backlash from the sunflare smash hit him with the force of a freight train. Every cell in his body felt like it had been put through a blender, his nervous system shorting out from the effort of channeling that much coordinated power. His vision tunneled to a pinprick, then went dark entirely as consciousness fled. But before everything went black, he heard Uraraka's voice, her real voice, human and concerned and wonderfully alive. Deku. Deku, stay with us, success, his ancestor whispered as awareness faded. Both legacies preserved, both honored. Well done, young sun-bearer. Thank you, Izuku thought back, for everything. When he woke up 6 hours later in the hospital, Recovery Girl was hovering over him with her usual mixture of professional concern and personal exasperation. Quirk exhaustion, thermal shock, neural overstimulation, and what my medical texts describe as catastrophic power integration syndrome, she announced, making notes on her clipboard. In other words, young man, you pushed yourself so far past your limits that you're lucky to be alive. Did we win? He asked weakly. See for yourself. She gestured toward the hospital room's window, where morning sunlight was streaming in through clean glass. Outside, he could see news vans and reporter crews covering what the media was calling the successful resolution of a League of Villains operation. No mention of demons or supernatural fusion, of course. As far as the public knew, it had been a straightforward hero versus villain encounter that ended with multiple arrests and no civilian casualties. The prisoners, he asked, all recovered safely. The League members escaped during the confusion, but their primary facility has been shut down and their research materials confiscated. Recovery Girl's expression softened slightly. You did good work, Midoriya. Reckless, dangerous, potentially suicidal work, but good nonetheless. Over the next few days, his classmates visited in shifts. Uraraka brought flowers and apologies for being such a pain to rescue. Todoroki discussed refinements to their combination techniques. Ida presented a formal report on the mission's tactical successes and areas for improvement. Even Bakugo showed up, though he spent most of the visit glaring at the wall and muttering about damn nerd and showing off. But the visit that mattered most came on the 3rd day, when All Might arrived with a small package and a complicated expression. How are you feeling, my boy? Like I got hit by a truck, Izuku admitted. But better than I expected, honestly. The power integration is stable now. I think the sunflare smash technique forced the synchronization to complete properly. About that, All Might settled into the visitor's chair with careful precision. The technique you used, combining both quirks into a single attack, that's not something any previous one for All Wielder has achieved. The power has always been singular, focused. What you did was something entirely new. Is that bad? On the contrary, it might be exactly what the world needs. All Might opened the package, revealing a small device that looked like a cross between a medal and a communication array. This is from the HPSC, official recognition of your service, along with a request for ongoing consultation on supernatural threat countermeasures. Izuku studied the device, his enhanced perception picking up subtle technological signatures. They want me to be their demon expert. Among other things, the League's research facility contained evidence of similar operations in at least 6 other locations. This isn't over, young Midoriya. If anything, what you uncovered was just the beginning. The weight of responsibility settled on Izuku's shoulders again, but this time it felt manageable. He had tools now, both quirks working in harmony, equipment designed for his specific needs, friends who understood what he was facing, and mentors who believed in his potential. What happens next? Training, All Might said simply. Lots and lots of training. If you're going to be the one standing between humanity and supernatural threats, we need to make sure you're prepared for anything. As evening approached and visiting hours ended, Izuku found himself alone with his thoughts and the warm certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The Age of Heroes was evolving, facing threats that previous generations couldn't have imagined. But they weren't facing those threats alone. Ready for what comes next? His ancestor asked. Ready as I'll ever be, Izuku replied, watching the sunset paint the hospital windows gold. Outside, the city was settling into evening routines, people going home to families, heroes beginning night patrols, students studying for exams. Normal life continuing because people like him stood ready to face the abnormal threats. The sun was setting on one chapter of his story, but tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove himself worthy of both the legacies he carried. And he would meet them with fire in his breath and light in his hands, surrounded by friends who trusted him and guided by ancestors who had faced similar darkness. The Age of Heroes was just beginning, and Izuku Midoriya, Sunbearer, Successor, Protector, was ready to help write its next chapter. One perfectly synchronized breath at a time. 3 weeks after the warehouse incident, Izuku stood in front of UA's main building watching news vans pack up their equipment and finally leave campus. The media attention had been intense but manageable. Hero students thwart League of Villains operation. UA first years save kidnapping victims. Young heroes demonstrate exceptional teamwork. All true as far as it went. The public didn't need to know about demon-human hybrids or supernatural possession or techniques inherited from Meiji-era demon slayers. Some secrets were worth keeping. Still feels weird, doesn't it? Uraraka appeared beside him, backpack slung over her shoulder and that familiar bright smile on her face. Being famous, I mean. I could do without it, Izuku admitted. The reporter interviews had been awkward enough when they'd focused on his unique thermal regulation techniques. He didn't want to imagine how they'd have gone if anyone had known the full truth. At least they spelled our names right this time, she said cheerfully, then her expression grew more serious. How are you really doing? I know the power integration was difficult. It was a fair question. The weeks since the warehouse had been a constant process of adjustment as his body adapted to having 2 fully synchronized quirks. Some days he felt like he could take on the world. Other days, the enhanced sensory input from his improved abilities left him with splitting headaches that even Recovery Girl's healing couldn't completely fix. But overall, better than I expected, he said honestly. The sunflare smash technique seems to have forced everything into proper alignment. My breathing patterns are stable, the thermal regulation is more efficient, and one for all feels natural now. Like it belongs? Good. Uraraka's relief was obvious. I was worried that saving me might have, broken something permanently. You're worth a little temporary system instability, Izuku said, then blushed when he realized how that sounded. I mean, not that you needed saving, exactly, you were fighting the possession really well on your own, Deku. Uraraka's smile was soft and genuinely grateful. Thank you. For not giving up on me. Before he could figure out how to respond to that, the moment was interrupted by the distinctive sound of Bakugo's explosions approaching at high speed. Oi Deku, Kacchan landed with his usual dramatic flair, small blasts from his palms cushioning the impact. Aizawa wants to see you in his office. Something about official business. Official business? Izuku's stomach did a small flip. In his experience, official business usually meant either very good news or very bad news, with no middle ground. Don't know, don't care, Bakugo said with his characteristic lack of interest in other people's problems. Just delivering the message. He paused, studying Izuku with an expression that was almost thoughtful. Though I gotta admit, that combination technique you pulled in the warehouse was pretty impressive. For a nerd, coming from Bakugo, that was practically a love letter. Thanks, Koch-chan. Don't let it go to your head, Bakugo replied, but there was something like approval in his voice. You're still a damn nerd who mutters too much. As his childhood friend blasted off toward the dorms, Izuku found himself smiling. Some things never changed, and honestly, he was glad for that. Growth was important, but so was continuity. Aizawa's office was exactly as welcoming as always, which is to say, it looked like the lair of someone who regarded human interaction as a necessary evil. The teacher was slumped behind his desk with a cup of coffee that smelled like it could dissolve steel, surrounded by paperwork that suggested he'd rather be literally anywhere else. Sit down, Midoriya. Aizawa gestured to the chair across from his desk without looking up from whatever report he was reading. We need to discuss your future. That sounds ominous, Izuku thought, but he took the offered seat and tried to project calm confidence. The HPSC has submitted a formal request, Aizawa continued, finally looking up with tired eyes. They want you to participate in a specialized training program over summer break. Advanced threat assessment, supernatural entity countermeasures, and what they're calling legacy technique integration. Meaning they want to turn you into their go-to expert on things that shouldn't exist. Aizawa's expression was carefully neutral. The warehouse incident proved that your inherited abilities are effective against bioquirk anomalies in ways that normal hero training can't replicate. They want to formalize that. Izuku considered this information carefully. On one hand, specialized training would help him better understand and control his abilities. On the other hand, becoming the government's designated demon hunter sounded like a fast track to a very dangerous and very lonely career. What do you think I should do? That's not my decision to make, Aizawa said firmly. But I will say this, your performance during the warehouse operation was exceptional. Not just your individual contributions, but the way you coordinated your classmates, adapted to changing circumstances, and found solutions that preserved life instead of simply eliminating threats. He paused, taking a sip of his weaponized coffee. Those are the qualities of a hero, not just a specialized weapon. Good advice, Izuku's ancestor murmured approvingly. Remember always that power serves purpose, not the reverse. Can I think about it? You have 2 weeks to decide. Aizawa pulled another form from his desk drawer and slid it across. In the meantime, there's this. The paper was an official commendation from the Japan Hero Public Safety Commission, recognizing exceptional service in the protection of civilian lives and the preservation of public safety. It was signed by the commission president herself, and came with a small medal that looked suspiciously like the communication device All Might had shown him in the hospital. Congratulations, Aizawa said dryly. You're officially a hero of note. Try not to let it go to your head. Walking back to the dorms, Izuku found his mind spinning with possibilities and complications. Official recognition was gratifying, but it also meant official attention. And official attention, in his experience, tended to come with official expectations that might not align with his personal goals. What do you think? He asked his ancestor silently. I think, came the thoughtful response, that you have grown much since we first spoke. The frightened boy who could barely control his breathing has become someone who can make decisions based on wisdom rather than fear. That doesn't answer my question, because the answer must come from you, not from me. I can offer guidance, but your path is your own to choose. The dorms were buzzing with their usual evening activity when he arrived. Kirishima and Seiro were playing video games in the common room, arguing loudly about proper combo techniques. Tokoyami was reading in a corner, Dark Shadow occasionally manifesting to make sarcastic comments about the book. Momo was helping Jiro with chemistry homework, both of them looking like they'd rather be doing literally anything else. Normal teenage life, in other words. The kind of normalcy he'd dreamed about during his quirkless years. Midoriya, Ida appeared from the direction of the kitchen, moving with his characteristic precise urgency. Perfect timing, I was hoping to discuss coordination protocols for our next joint training exercise. Sure, Izuku said, settling onto one of the common room couches. What did you have in mind? What followed was a detailed technical conversation about tactical communication methods, backup procedures, and the kind of systematic planning that made Ida such an effective class representative. But underneath the professional discussion, Izuku could sense something else, genuine friendship built through shared challenges and mutual respect. These people trust me, he realized. Not because of my quirks or my family history or my potential as a weapon against supernatural threats. They trust me because of who I choose to be. The conversation was joined by other classmates as the evening progressed. Todoroki offered insights about temperature-based coordination techniques. Uraraka suggested refinements to their gravity-assisted mobility tactics. Even Bakugo contributed a few grudging observations about explosive support strategies, though he delivered them with his usual charming vocabulary. By the time they headed to bed, Izuku felt more centered than he had in weeks. The HPSC's offer was important, and he'd need to consider it carefully, but whatever he decided, he wouldn't be facing the consequences alone. His phone buzzed as he was getting ready for sleep. A text from All Might. How did the meeting with Aizawa go? Izuku typed back, interesting. Need to think about some things. Can we talk tomorrow? Of course. I'm proud of you, my boy. Whatever you decide. The response made something warm unfurl in Izuku's chest. Pride, not in his power or his potential, but in his choices. In the person he was becoming rather than the weapon he could be forged into. He was settling under his covers when his ancestor's voice spoke up one last time. There is something I must tell you, the ancient presence said, sounding more solid and present than it had in weeks, about what lies ahead. What kind of something? The warehouse was not an isolated incident. The research you disrupted, the techniques they were developing, it is part of something larger, older, a conflict that has been building for generations. Izuku sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. What kind of conflict? The kind that requires both wisdom and strength to resolve. The kind that will test everything you have learned about power and responsibility. A pause heavy with implication. The demons your great-great-grandfather fought were the last remnants of an ancient evil, but evil, once seeded, can grow again if the conditions are right. And the conditions are right now. They are becoming right. The League of Villains is not acting alone. They are being guided by something that has waited decades for the world to forget the old warnings. Something that sees the current age of heroes as an opportunity rather than an obstacle. The implications of that revelation settled over Izuku like a heavy blanket. Not just random villain activity, but organized supernatural threat. Not just isolated incidents, but a coordinated campaign against everything he'd sworn to protect. How long do we have? Unknown, but not long. His ancestor's voice carried centuries of hard-won wisdom, which is why your training must accelerate, why your bonds with your allies must strengthen, why you must choose your path carefully. The HPSC training program would provide useful skills. But remember, governments change, policies shift, priorities are reassigned. Your classmates, your mentor, your own moral compass. These things endure. Izuku lay back down, staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything he'd learned. Supernatural threats, ancient conflicts, the weight of inherited responsibility, and the need to make choices that would affect not just his own future, but the safety of everyone he cared about. No pressure at all, he thought with dark humor. But as overwhelming as it all seemed, he wasn't the same terrified 14-year-old who'd first encountered a demon in a dark alley. He'd grown, learned, found his balance between power and restraint, strength and wisdom. Most importantly, he'd found people worth fighting for. Ready? His ancestor asked. Ready, Izuku replied and meant it. Outside his window, the city lights twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing lives and dreams and futures worth protecting. Somewhere in those lights, heroes were on patrol, keeping the peace and standing guard against threats both mundane and extraordinary. Tomorrow, he would make his decision about the HPSC's offer. He would continue his training, strengthen his bonds with his classmates, and prepare for whatever challenges lay ahead. But tonight, he would rest and dream of a future where the sun would always rise on a world worth saving. The age of heroes was evolving, facing threats that demanded new solutions and new kinds of strength. And Izuku Midoriya, Sunbearer, successor, friend, was ready to help write that evolution. One breath at a time, one choice at a time, one dawn at a time. The sun always rises, his ancestor whispered as sleep finally claimed him. Remember that when the darkness seems complete. The sun always rises. I'll remember, Izuku promised. And in his dreams, he could see it, a golden light breaking over the horizon, warming a world where heroes and friends stood together against whatever shadows dared to threaten the dawn. The story was just beginning, but the ending, he was certain, would be written in light. Man, watching Deku go from that scared kid to someone who can literally coordinate his entire class through breathing techniques. Chef's kiss, that sunflare smash where he perfectly synced both quirks, gave me chills. And don't even get me started on him saving Uraraka from possession, the power of friendship, but make it thermal regulation. What moment hit you the hardest? Let me know down below. Subscribe if you want more wild crossover concepts like this, and seriously, drop your what-if ideas because I'm always hunting for the next story that'll blow our minds. Catch you next time.